If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 61, The Isolated Island. Time flew by. 7 days had passed since Will and his group arrived in Jubilance Town. Today would be their last. Liz and the army had already packed their belongings, ready to set out on the road back to the capital. Aside from the one day he spent playing on the beach with Liz, Will had spent the rest of the time taking the Gyarados into the sea for group battles. They had fought their way from the coastal waters of Jubilance Town to a point more than 100 meters from the shore. Will had lost count of how many water-type Pokémon he had defeated. By now, the moment he and the Gyarados appeared in the sea, all the surrounding Pokémon would shrink back in fear, leaving only some of the less intelligent common fish to swim around. At the entrance of the mayor's villa. Status: Dragonair. Potential: Purple. Level: 37. Type: Dragon. Ability: Shed Skin. Height: 9.5 m. Weight: 45 kilograms. Held item: Mystic Water. Moves: Focus Energy, Inherited, Wrap, Leer, Twister, Thunder Wave, Dragon Tail, Agility, Slam, Icy Wind, Aqua Tail, Thunderbolt, Takedown, Thunder, Brine. 7 days in Jubilance Town, and he had gained 2 levels. He had also obtained the excellent item Mystic Water and learned the move Brine from the constant underwater battles. This trip to Jubilance Town was really the right call, Will thought. Such a huge harvest made him feel it was all worthwhile. Lan, I heard from Elder Barb that there's an isolated island off the coast of Jubilance Town. Shall we go and see? Liz's voice came from behind him. Sure, Will turned and agreed. Today was their last day. Liz probably wanted one last look around before they left. After all, who knew when they would next come to Jubilance Town? As for the isolated island, Will hadn't actually seen one. In the 100-meter-plus range that he and the Gyarados had already explored, there was no such thing. There was a tiny islet in the games, but it was very, very small and had nothing on it. He didn't know if this was the one Liz was talking about. Then shall we set off now? I want to have a good time today and explore with you, Lan. Liz walked up and hugged Will, then, remembering something, she quickly added, and, of course, with Blaze and Scorp. Haha, then let's go, Will smiled, extending his tail to coil around Liz and Blaze and flying towards the sea. Glee glee, big bro, what about me? Scorp's anxious voice sounded from behind. Don't you know how to fly? Fly yourself, Will said. He had no desire to carry that hard-shelled creature. He first brought Liz and the others to the seaside and called out the 2 Gyarados. Liz, Blaze, you two sit on the Gyarados' heads. See how it feels, Will said, placing Liz and Blaze on the massive heads of the 2 Gyarados, respectively. Is it okay? Won't Carp throw me off? Liz asked, a little worried. She was used to being carried by Will, where being wrapped in his tail felt very secure. Roar! Her Gyarados roared, indicating that she could trust him completely. Char char! Blaze, on the other hand, was excitedly bouncing on Iris's Gyarados' head. Gleescorp was also quite lazy. It glided over and landed right next to Blaze, hitching a ride. Iris's Gyarados rolled its eyes. Let's go, Will said, setting off first to lead the way once he saw they were all ready. To be honest, he was very curious what it felt like to ride a Gyarados. He felt that anyone who had ever dreamed of being a Pokémon trainer would be curious about what it felt like to ride a water-type Pokémon across the sea. Many, like him, must have fantasized about riding a Lapras with their Pokémon partners. On the open sea, Will flew close to the surface, flanked by the 2 Gyarados. Another new experience. These creatures, these beasts, are truly magical. And not at all like how people in the past described them, Liz lamented, breathing out a warm puff of air as she sat on the Gyarados' head, feeling the sea breeze and looking out at the calm ocean. She had always heard people say how dangerous beasts were, how evil they were. But when she personally lived with them, she found that what others said was not necessarily true. Humans still have too many misunderstandings about beasts. Perhaps, in the future, I can try to change these views. Liz looked at Will, then at the lively Blaze and Scorp, then reached down to stroke the rough skin of the Gyarados below her. An idea began to form in her heart. Liz had no grand goal of making the world more peaceful. She just wanted Will and the others to be able to live more comfortably in human society, without having to endure so many strange looks. While Liz was lost in thought, they had gradually come to see an island floating on the sea. It actually exists, Will said, frowning at the island ahead. It didn't look very large, maybe about the size of the capital city. He estimated it would only take him 10 minutes to fly from its southernmost point to its northernmost. Glee. Scorp, however, looked at the island with surprise. He had thought they were just out to play. He hadn't expected to be coming back to his old home. They reached the shore. With Will's help, Liz climbed down from the Gyarados' head and landed on the soft sand. At that moment, many purple figures flew out from the nearby woods. Glee. Gligar. Glee. So many Gligar. Will's gaze shifted over, a sense of shock in his heart. Before them were at least 15 Gligar of various sizes. Gligar, Scorp said, scratching his head and then waving his arms at the others. This is your home? Will asked, his eyes widening in even greater surprise. This wasn't right. The Pokédex clearly described Gligar as building their nests on steep cliffs. But this swarm of Gligar was living together on a flat, forested, isolated island. Looks like the Pokédex isn't complete. Even in the era of leagues, humanity's research on Pokémon still has a long way to go, Will thought to himself, finding the discovery novel and exciting. His god's eye view had failed him. This didn't disappoint him, in fact, it made him feel a little thrilled. To personally discover a Pokémon's habits that were outside the Pokédex gave him a great sense of accomplishment. Wow! So many score! Char char! Roar! Liz and the others were also a little surprised to see so many Gligar, but only for a moment. They didn't know much about the species to begin with, so they didn't find it as strange as Will did that Gligar were living here. Gliss score! Suddenly, a massive roar erupted from the center of the island. The sound was far more domineering and wild than the Gligar's cries. It was so powerful that just hearing it made Will's scales stand on end. A Gliscor, Will said. He didn't even need to see the target to know what kind of creature had made that sound. Chapter 62, The Condition for a Razor Fang. Just as Will guessed the opponent's identity, a giant Gliscor, leading a swarm of dozens of Gligar, appeared in the sky above the distant forest. This is a little bit bad, Will said, frowning as he looked at the swarm. Scorp was about 2 years old, with a level of around 25, similar to the two Gyarados. But comparing their physiques, the 3 or 4 Gligar flanking the Gliscor had to be at least LV 40 or higher. That meant the Gliscor itself was likely LV 45 or even LV 50. In MT Silver, that would make it a hegemon of the middle ring. No wonder it could lead its entire clan to occupy this isolated island, it had the strength to back it up. But Will wasn't too panicked. The sea was right behind them. Because of their wings, Gligar and Gliscor are very slow in the water. They can hardly even submerge, their bodies just float uncontrollably. So, if the Gliscor showed any hostility, he would take Liz and the others into the water and dive deep at once. That probably won't be necessary, Will thought, relaxing slightly as he glanced at Scorp. Scorp's expression was completely at ease, without a hint of nervousness. It seemed he got along very well with his clan. With that connection, they shouldn't be in any danger. Lan, Liz said. She hadn't noticed Scorp's expression. Her own face was stern, but she showed little fear. Her sense of security came from the little ones around her. Although they were greatly outnumbered, she still felt safe. Gleefully watching the 8-meter-long Gliscor fly closer, Scorp raised a pincer and waved, giving a casual greeting. So you're the prince, kid, Will's eyes widened when he heard what Scorp called the Gliscor. But it also put his heart completely at ease. Scorp had just called the Gliscor Pops. Glee, now everyone calls him Pops, Scorp shook his head with a casual smile. Oh, so he's the Edward Newgate of Gliscors, Will said, looking up as the Alpha began its gliding descent. It was incredibly fast. Despite being 70 or 80 meters away, it landed in less than 10 seconds. After landing and raising its tail, the Gliscor still stood 4 meters tall. The Pokédex only listed Gliscor's length at 2 meters. This one was 4 times that size. This was, without a doubt, the largest size multiplier Will had seen since coming to this world. This guy is an alpha, Will realized. Wild Pokémon that had a sizable clan in a large enough territory could obtain the alpha designation, which would cause their physique to grow. The Dratini line was simply too rare. Will had never seen a second Dratini or Dragonair, let alone enough to establish a clan. So, he was destined never to receive the alpha designation in this life. Besides, he didn't know if he counted as having a trainer now. If he did, then he could no longer become an alpha. The alpha status could only be obtained before having a trainer. That way, even if you lost the designation later, your body wouldn't shrink back down. Glee. The Gliscor stood 10 meters away from them. It glanced at them, could tell they were just a bunch of kids, and focused its gaze on Scorp. Gligar, Scorp nodded, then pointed a pincer at Liz. The meaning was clear, he was going to live with this human from now on and wasn't coming home. Glee, the Gliscor hesitated. It looked at Liz, then at the other Pokémon by her side, and finally nodded. This was the first time it had ever encountered such a situation. But seeing that the other Pokémon with Liz were free and growing up strong and healthy, it felt it could try to trust this human. As a father, he had never wanted to keep his children by his side forever. He only stopped the weaker Gligar from leaving because he was afraid they would die out there for no reason. Hello, at this moment, Will stepped forward and spoke. Glee. The Gliscor shifted its gaze to this large creature. Excuse me, do you have the item that allows a Gligar to evolve? Will was confident that an old-timer like this Gliscor would know what evolution was, though it certainly wouldn't have heard of the item Razor Fang. That was a name given by future humans. Generally, a Razor Fang could be obtained from 3 types of Pokémon. The first was from a Gligar itself, but the probability was very low, their bodies didn't have enough energy to produce such a special fang. The second was from its evolution, Gliscor. A Gliscor would shed 2 fangs every year, and these were essentially Razor Fangs. The last was from a Bruxish, a water/psychic type Pokémon first discovered in the Alola region, whose teeth were so hard they could chew through a Shelter's shell. Originally, Will had no idea where he would find a Razor Fang for Scorp. He had never expected to meet another Gligar, let alone a Gliscor. But who would have thought that a huge Gligar swarm lived on this isolated island off the coast of Jubilance Town? He wasn't about to pass up such a rare opportunity. Glee. Yes, for him, Will said, indicating Scorp. Glee glee. The Gliscor lifted its head, grinned, and said a few words. Will was silent for a moment. The Gliscor's meaning was that if he wanted a Razor Fang, he would have to defeat it in battle. It didn't have to be Scorp, Will could be the challenger. But right now, no one on their side was a match for the Gliscor. Even if they all attacked together, they couldn't win. Glee glee. Go back. When you are stronger, come and challenge me again. The Gliscor waved a pincer, signaling for them to leave. He had no intention of inviting them into his home. Having traveled all over the Johto region in his youth, the Gliscor was not fond of humans. If not for the fact that these Pokémon were gathered around Liz and that his own son considered her a friend, he might have attacked and killed her directly. He didn't want this island to be exposed to human eyes, it would only bring misfortune to his clan. Thank you. Will didn't waste any more words. He turned and led Liz and the others away. Although he hadn't gotten the Razor Fang, he had at least gotten the Gliscor's promise. In the future, once he evolved into a Dragonite, he was confident he could defeat it. At that time, he could get the Razor Fang for Scorp and let him evolve into the next Gliscor. Chapter 63, The Little Green Chicken. During the days Will and the others were on their way back to the capital, an interesting thing happened to Iris. One afternoon, a bored Iris was wandering alone in her family's backyard mini ranch. This small ranch had been built by her father for her to play in. It was like a small zoo, with chicks, puppies, lambs, and the like. Sigh, when are Lan and the others coming back? Iris sighed, listlessly scattering millet on the ground. A flock of chicks followed behind her, pecking at the feed. Before, she had found this quite amusing. But after spending time with Will, she found that these ordinary little animals weren't that fun anymore. Compared to Will, they just weren't very intelligent. They did the same things every day, and she could always predict their behavior. I'm so jealous of Auntie. I want my own beast too, Iris sighed again, squatting down dejectedly. She didn't know that the Magikarp she had been raising was, in fact, a beast. Her carp was just too dumb, even more useless than a useless fish. In Iris's heart, a beast didn't have to be as smart as Will, but it should at least have some magical quality. Her Magikarp had none. Ouch! Just as Iris was staring blankly at the ground, she felt a sharp pain on her slippered foot. It felt like she had been pecked by a chick. Annoyed, she turned to see which little chick was asking for a hot bath. The next second, she froze on the spot. Before her was a round, blank-faced, little chicken. Iris didn't know it, but this little chicken was called a Natu, and its classification was the tiny bird Pokémon. A little green chicken, Iris blinked, looking down at the Natu. This Natu was only 0.15 meters tall, no different in size from the surrounding chicks and even smaller than the Pokédex value. In the era of leagues, a Pokémon of this height would be considered malnourished. In this era of primal beasts, it was without a doubt a newborn baby. Even a malnourished beast in this era wouldn't be smaller than the Pokédex standard. The Natu didn't speak, just quietly tilted its head back to stare at Iris. Its gaze was vacant. Iris couldn't even see her own reflection in its large eyes. She wasn't even sure if it was looking at her or at something else entirely. "Where did you come from, little chicken?" Iris asked, squatting down to look at the Natu curiously. She remembered very clearly that there were no green chicks in her backyard. Besides, this one's eyes were so big, and its body was so round, it was completely different from a normal chick. It definitely wasn't from the same brood. Seeing Iris squat down, the Natu hopped back a couple of times to create some distance. Then it just stood there again, silently staring. "You're a strange little chicken. Here, have some," Iris smiled, tossing the remaining millet in her hand to the Natu's feet. The Natu immediately lowered its head and pecked at the food. It was clearly very hungry. Iris quietly watched it finish the millet, then run over to a puppy's bowl and drink all the goat milk inside. Woof woof. The puppy, Uma, which had been lying in its doghouse, saw that its milk was gone and ran out angrily, barking at the Natu. The Natu was frightened and flapped its tiny wings, hopping behind Iris to hide. Although the expression on its face was still unreadable, its panicked actions revealed its fear. It didn't understand that it had eaten someone else's food. In its eyes, the milk was just sitting there, so it must have been something no one wanted. It was just eating trash. All right, Uma. I'll get you some more," Iris said, squatting down to pat the puppy's head. Then, she took the opportunity to scoop up the Natu that was hiding behind her. "Ooh, so soft, and so light." Iris gently stroked the Natu's body. From the outside, a Natu looks like a smooth rubber ball, but it actually has very soft and delicate feathers, like the yellow down of a chick before it grows its adult plumage. The Natu fluttered in her arms a couple of times. Seeing that struggling was useless, it gave up and chose to nestle obediently in her embrace. "You're a beast, aren't you?" Iris said, confirming her suspicion after a moment. Having seen so many strange Pokémon with Will, Iris could now tell if something was a Pokémon even without any formal knowledge. Moreover, she had even learned to judge whether a beast was dangerous and whether she could try to approach it just by observing its eyes and behavior. The Natu belonged to the category that was safe to approach. The Natu was unresponsive. It didn't understand the concept of a beast. It could only sense that this strange creature in front of it meant it no harm. Natu is a flying/psychic type Pokémon, and the vast majority of psychic types have a keen perception of the emotions of other living things. They can distinguish between goodwill and malice. A Pokémon like Ralts can even perceive a person's emotions and whether their heart is pure. Although many people fantasize about taking a Gardevoir, the final evolution of Ralts, as their wife, those who actually try with such thoughts are doomed to fail. In the anime, you can see that the many Ralts only appear near children and the elderly, like the one that befriended Max in the Hone region. It was precisely because Max's heart was pure and he genuinely liked the Ralts that it was willing to interact with him and become his friend. "If you have nowhere else to go, you can stay with me. I'll raise you to be big and strong, as big as Lan. You don't know who Lan is, do you? He's my good friend. I'll introduce you to him when he gets back." Iris held the Natu, telling it many things that it couldn't understand. The Natu stared blankly at the person before it, then bobbed its body up and down in a nod. Although it didn't really understand what this creature was saying, it could feel its emotions. This upright ape seemed to like it a lot. The Natu found this feeling very nice, it made it feel safe, so it decided to stay by this person's side. "Yay! Then we're friends from now on. I have to give you a name. You look a little naturally dopey, so how about I call you Natty?" "Hehe, that's a good name, right?" Iris happily hugged Natty and spun around in her small world. And as she spun, Natty felt the gentle breeze and subconsciously flapped its tiny wings. For the first time, it experienced the feeling of flying. It was a good feeling. It wanted Iris to experience it too. Chapter 64, Resist. Fight that feeling. On the way back from Jubilance Town, Will no longer focused on training the two Gyarados. His attention had shifted to Blaze the Charmander. By now, the levels of the two Gyarados and Scorp were all around 25, they wouldn't deviate far from that number. Having been through the level 25 range twice himself, he had a good understanding of the energy and strength a Pokémon should have at that stage. Blaze, on the other hand, was a different story. When they first met, he was probably only level 5. In Jubilance Town, Liz would occasionally take him to battle wild beasts. But Liz's command skills were questionable, and Blaze's own battle sense and experience were practically zero, so after 1 or 2 fights a day, he would be too injured to continue. Under these conditions, he had only gained 1 or 2 levels during their stay. The road from Jubilance Town to the Dragonite capital was like the second route a player enters after leaving the starting village in a game. The Pokémon that appeared were not high level. Seeing that these Pokémon couldn't serve as experience packs for himself, Will decided to focus all his energy on Blaze. And so, in just 1 week, he had raised the Charmander from LV7 to LV14. Leveling up is easier in the early stages, that's one thing. But more importantly, Will had already accumulated a lot of experience. It was as if he were a cultivator who had reached the Golden Core stage twice, now guiding a talented prodigy to the Foundation Establishment stage. It was as natural as drinking water. However, just as they were about to reach the capital, on a patch of grassland near the Persian herd's territory, a small incident occurred. Good, Blaze. Use a final ember to finish the battle. Char char. With a spray of embers from Blaze's mouth, a Meowth on the plains was knocked down. Aqua Tail. Will, as a matter of course, swept his tail, casually using the water-type move to extinguish the small patch of grass Blaze had ignited. The battle was officially over. Char char. Just as Will finished cleaning up, an impassioned cry erupted from behind him. He turned his head and saw that Blaze was extremely agitated, the flame on his tail burning fiercely as his body began to glow with a white light. This isn't right. Will's eyes widened. He suddenly remembered something and quickly roared at the Charmander, hold it back. Resist that feeling. Char. Hearing Will's voice, Blaze subconsciously began to follow his command, although he didn't understand why. But while Blaze didn't understand, Will did. Based on his understanding of Charmander, its current level was definitely not high enough for it to evolve. This meant that its evolution right now was not a natural one from sufficient energy accumulation, but one caused by overly intense emotions temporarily raising its energy to the evolutionary threshold. This had happened many times in the anime. To save their trainer from a crisis, a Pokémon's emotions would intensify, forcing itself to evolve. But the first season of the anime had already explained this phenomenon. It was a clear case of pulling the seedlings to help them grow, a detrimental shortcut. The classic example was Ash's Charmander. When Ash's Charizard first arrived at the Cherrycific Valley, its problems were pointed out immediately. Because it had been forced to evolve twice in a single day due to intense emotions, going straight from Charmander to Charizard, its physique was very small, and its strength in its normal state was completely inferior to that of other Charizard. Although it later trained in the valley for a long time, constantly strengthening its foundation to make up for this energy deficit, the disadvantage in its physique was very difficult to remedy. However, to be able to forcibly evolve twice in one day was also a testament to the talent of Ash's Charizard. It could absolutely be called a genius among geniuses. It worked. Phew, Will said, breathing a sigh of relief as he watched the white light on Blaze's body gradually recede. Char. In short, if you ever encounter a situation like this in the future, calm your emotions first. If the feeling is still there after you've calmed down, then you can let it continue, Will explained simply, unable to give the full details. Char, Blaze nodded obediently. Although the little guy was a bit mischievous at times, he was still very obedient. He should be close to evolving into a Charmeleon soon. Will thought, looking down at Blaze, who had plopped down on the ground to rest. However, for the next little while, he would no longer be training Liz's Pokémon. He planned to go to MT Silver by himself and live there for a period of time. It could be a long time, or it could be short. In his plan, Will intended to train in MT Silver until he evolved into a Dragonite before coming out. But this was just a plan. If any unforeseen circumstances arose, or if something happened with Liz, he would return at top speed. Still, he couldn't just ignore Liz's other Pokémon. So, before he left, he had to arrange a place for them that could help them grow. The next morning, the main caravan arrived at the capital. Will had just returned to the palace and hadn't even had a chance to sit down and catch his breath when he saw Iris running over with a Natu in her arms. "Where did you get a Natu?" Will's eyes widened. He really couldn't imagine how Iris had managed to catch a Pokémon on her own, even if this Natu looked like it had only just left its infant stage. "Lan. Look. This is Natty." My partner Iris held the Natu in her arms up high, looking very proud. "Amazing, amazing," Will said, extending his tail to gently stroke Iris's head, and then the dopey-looking Natty. The Natu's body went stiff, it seemed very afraid of Will. That was normal. The Natu wasn't even as big as one of Will's eyeballs. "Lan, did you miss me these past few days? You should go find your Gyarados." Will coiled his tail around both Iris and her Natu and tossed them out of the bedroom. He was tired. Today, he just wanted to curl up under the covers and sleep. Tomorrow, he still had to arrange a new home for the other Pokémon. "It looks like Lan wants to sleep, Natty. Let's not bother him. I'll take you to see Little Splasher," Iris said, carrying Natty and running towards the backyard. It was obvious who Little Splasher was. However, when Liz pointed to the supergiant Gyarados and told her that this was her Little Splasher, Iris was so shocked she dropped Natty on the ground. But Natty had no time to worry about that. Just like Iris, it stood frozen on the spot, like a terrified wooden doll. Will, despite his size, looked beautiful and gentle. But a Gyarados, its huge mouth looked like it could swallow 80 Natas in one bite. Roar! Iris's Gyarados, seeing that its trainer didn't seem to recognize it, rolled its eyes and thought for a moment. It had a flash of inspiration, remembering Liz's Gyarados. It quickly flopped onto the ground and began to furiously twist its body, cursing Mother Earth. Natty's eyes widened. "What is it doing?" Iris frowned. Chapter 65, The Dusk Stone. Once Iris accepted the fact that the Gyarados was her Little Splasher, she was beyond ecstatic. Iris was a complete aesthetics chaser, there was no doubt about it. Every time she saw a cute Pokémon, she would beg Will to find a way for her to cuddle with it. But that didn't mean she only liked cute types. Domineering types, cool types, as long as it looked good, she liked it. It was just that those types often looked very strong, and she was usually too scared to approach them. But her Gyarados was different. She was familiar with it. For days on end, she had carried the endlessly splashing Magikarp all over the palace. So, after confirming its identity, the first thing Iris did was to ride on its head and parade it around the capital, startling many of the residents. Iris's mother was also a formidable woman. Ignoring the Gyarados' ferocious face, she dragged Iris home for a sound spanking. Of course, Will only heard about these events from Liz the next day. He had been asleep and had missed all the fun. But in any case, Iris's Gyarados finally had a proper home and no longer had to wait all day in the palace's backyard pond for Iris to have time to visit. The Palace Treasury. The Palace Treasury was located in the first basement level of the palace. Below it was a second basement level, with an entrance under the throne and an exit leading to a certain spot on the plains outside the palace. It was meant to be used as a shelter in case the kingdom was overthrown. Currently, the only human who knew of its existence was Liz. Besides her, there was only him, a Pokémon. "Let's see what kind of treasures are in here." Will went to the treasury alone. Although he already had a way to obtain a Razor Fang to evolve Scorp, who was to say he couldn't find another one in the treasury? Then he wouldn't have to make a special trip back to Jubilance Town. And perhaps there would be other useful items. He opened the large wooden doors of the treasury. The sight that greeted him was not a glittering mountain of gold. This didn't surprise him. Every world has its treasures, and every era has its context. In the world of Pokémon, gold wasn't worthless, its value was still high, but not as high as it was on Earth. And in this era, where humans were still fighting over iron mines, the amount of gold that had been excavated was very, very small. The currency people used now was still a silver coin made of a little silver and a lot of impurities. So, the gold content in the palace treasury was very low. Will could hardly see any golden light at all. What he saw were large chests, about 10 of them, filled with miscellaneous items. "Turns out Liz is poorer than I thought." Will glanced at the vast but barren treasury and realized he had been under a misconception. He had assumed that as the queen of a nation, Liz must be incredibly wealthy, the richest woman in the Dragonite kingdom. He was wrong. Looking at the reality of the situation, the Johto region was only so big. Even though the Dragonite Kingdom had unified it, its territory wasn't that large, and the treasures on this continent were naturally not that plentiful. Moreover, the Dragonite Kingdom had only been established for 10 years. Before that, it was just the Dragonite tribe. How many treasures could be collected in just 10 years? Liz was not the kind of tyrant who would plunder the wealth of her people. So, the palace treasury really didn't have mountains of treasure piled up. Will opened all the chests and dumped their contents onto the floor to search. And he did indeed find some good things. For example, a type of stone. A dusk stone. Will found many blackish-purple, crystal-clear gems on the floor. They were quite beautiful, a translucent purple substance encased a pitch-black mass within. To the people of this era, these were probably just pretty jewels. They certainly hadn't discovered the special effect a dusk stone has on certain Pokémon. In the Johto region, the Pokémon that can use a dusk stone are Murkrow and Misdreavus. Very good. If I run into one, I can catch it, Will nodded with satisfaction. Both of these Pokémon were worth raising. Setting aside their performance in the games, in reality, they were extremely practical and powerful Pokémon, especially at night, when their natural advantages would be amplified. A Murkrow, cloaked in black, could become one with the darkness, able to spot anything that reflected light, and they were exceptionally cunning. A Misdreavus could hide its form in the shadows, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. To be precise, a Murkrow would be skilled at guarding Liz at night, while a Misdreavus would be skilled at assassinating enemies at her command. What else is there? Let's see. Will grinned, in a good mood. He had just started and had already found a treasure that could expand his choice of targets. Of course, he was still hoping to find something that could increase his own strength. A dragon scale. TCH. Next, Will found a scale. It was mainly blue, with a bit of an iridescent sheen at its sharp tip. This item was used to evolve a Seadra into a Kingdra. It was useless to him. He also had no plans to catch a Seadra for Liz to raise. A Gyarados could at least move on land like a snake, and its speed wasn't too slow. But a Seadra, its speed on land was probably about the same as a Dragonese. The wars of this era were mainly fought on land, so it was not a wise choice to raise an aquatic Pokémon with poor mobility. After that, Will searched carefully again. At least among the things he could recognize, there was nothing else useful. Of course, that was because he didn't recognize most of the items. The real-life items might look different from their icons in the games, which was why he couldn't identify them. A pity. All I found was a dusk stone that I might not even get to use, Will sighed and turned to leave. The dusk stone would only be useful if he actually caught a Murkrow or a Misdreavus. But unfortunately, both of those Pokémon were hard to find. A Murkrow's movements were erratic, it would sleep whenever it was tired, day or night, so you could encounter one at any time. A Misdreavus, on the other hand, only appeared at night, and its species had no sense of territory. Its Pokédex entry stated two things: scaring people is its reason for living, it never misses a day of practice, and it seems to use the red orbs on its neck to absorb the fear of others, which it uses as nourishment. So, they wouldn't stay in one area, they would run all over the place. Wherever they could scare other creatures, that's where they would go. With no fixed habitat, they were even harder to find. Oh well. If I find one, I'll catch it. If not, my original targets are still good. First, I need to sort out the situation with Blaze and the others, Will decided, returning to the ground floor. He was preparing to leave the capital in a day or two and first had to set up a future training path for Blaze and the others. Chapter 66, It Couldn't Be. Because of you? Will still hadn't told Liz that he was planning to leave for a while. He mainly didn't know how to express it in a way she would understand. After pondering it alone for a while, he decided to send Blaze and the others to the Primal Beast Academy. Although the battle frequency at the academy was low, they at least held battles, making it a safe and comfortable place for them to level up. Liz was usually busy and likely wouldn't have time to take them to the plains outside the capital to train. But if the Pokémon were just left to play in the palace all day, their leveling speed would be too slow. So, it seemed the academy was the only option. Besides, he was the recognized boss of the Pokémon at the academy. He could use this status to manipulate things and increase the daily battle intensity for Blaze and the others. Having made up his mind, Will immediately found Blaze, Scorp, and the Gyarados and led them towards the academy. As for Iris's Gyarados and Natu, there was no need for them to train. Iris's status was different from Liz's, she was unlikely to face assassination attempts, and at her young age, she wouldn't encounter much danger. As long as she stayed obediently in the capital, there would be no problems. So, it was enough for her Pokémon to just play with her and grow up peacefully. He couldn't explain this plan to Liz with words. He could only show her through his actions, and then she would probably understand his meaning. Everything went just as he had planned. When he brought the 3 Pokémon to the academy, he quickly alerted the 2 scholars on duty. The scholars immediately went to the palace to find Liz and ask what was going on. Will seized this opportunity to gather all the Pokémon on the plains. These 3 are my underlings. From now on, I need you to find at least 3 suitable opponents for each of them to battle every day, Will announced, standing in the center of the field. This was his plan, to use his status as the boss to forcibly arrange opponents for them. 3 was the perfect number. 1 battle in the morning, 1 at noon, and 1 in the afternoon, with time to rest in between. For inexperienced Pokémon like them, this intensity was just right. If it were him, he would start with 4 or 5 battles, and on a good day, he could even do more than a dozen. The numerous Pokémon on the plains looked at each other, then nodded in agreement. To ensure they understood his meaning, Will immediately began a practical demonstration on the spot. As evening fell, Will led Blaze and the others back to the palace. Lan, do you want Blaze and the others to go to the school with you to train? Liz, as expected, had figured out his intention, though with a slight misunderstanding. It wasn't that they were going with him, but that they were going on their own. But Will couldn't explain the nuance, so he just nodded. It was now a common occurrence for him not to go to the academy, so everyone was used to it. I've already spoken with the academy. Good. By the way, Lan, it looks like you're about to molt today, Liz said, pointing to his tail. Will turned his head and saw that there was indeed a small, translucent white piece of skin already peeling away. Perfect. You can help me molt one last time today. I don't know when the next time will be, Will said, coiling his tail around Liz and bringing her back to the bedroom. He then lay on the bed and let her do the work. Lan, I've collected a lot of your shed skin. I'm planning to make some things with it, Liz said, kneeling skillfully on the soft mattress as she helped him peel. Her movements were quick but gentle, not causing him any discomfort. Go ahead. What are you planning to make? Will flicked the tip of his tail nonchalantly, not paying much mind. The shed skin of a Dratini and Dragonair was an ultra-high-class, super rare material. In the future era of leagues, only the Dragonite clan and the very wealthy could afford to wear it. Claire's cape was made from the skin shed by her own Dragonair. As for Lance, only one of his capes was made from his Dragonite's old sheds, the others were replicas of the same style that he bought at the Celadon department store. That guy really loved his capes. Not only that, but members of the Dragonite clan also liked to wear boots of the same color as their hair. It was said that those boots were also made with Dragonair skin. Claire not only had such boots, but she also often wore sky blue leather gloves. Come to think of it, the people of the Dragonite clan really love capes. Why is that? The question popped into Will's head. I plan to use your baby skins to make a pair of gloves, your grown-up skins to make a cape, and if there's any left, maybe I can make some boots. What do you think? Liz asked, smiling as she looked at Will. It couldn't be, because of you, could it? Will felt like he had just discovered something. But it didn't matter, he wasn't too concerned about such a small thing. Liz, I'm planning to leave for a while, Will hesitated for a moment, then tried to say it. He turned his head to look at her, wondering if she could understand. What? All right, it's nothing, Will sighed. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't just leave suddenly, could he? Lan, you just told me something important, didn't you? Liz stopped what she was doing and looked at the back of his head. Will said, flapping the small feathery wings on his head. It was the lazy version of a nod. Others might not understand, but Liz certainly would. I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you meant, Liz lowered her head, a little ashamed. You don't need to apologize. It's not your fault, Will got up and nuzzled her cheek, then lay back down. He patted her thigh with his tail, signaling her to continue. What are you planning to do, Lan? Liz pressed. She felt it was something very important, something she had to know. You'll know tomorrow, Will said after a moment of silent thought, his eyes brightening slightly. He knew what he had to do. That night, Will tossed and turned, unable to sleep. He got up from the bed, floated to the window, and looked outside. At 10 o'clock at night, the streets of the capital still had many lights on. He could vaguely see the smiles on the faces of some of the residents. I'm starting to feel a sense of belonging here. Is it because of Liz? Will remembered that when he first arrived, he didn't care at all about the lives or deaths of the people of the Dragonite Kingdom. If an army had invaded the next day, he would have immediately taken Liz and fled, abandoning everyone else. But now, thinking about that situation again, he would feel a sense of hesitation. Will believed he would still make the correct choice to save Liz and Iris first and worry about the future later. But after doing so, he would surely feel a sense of guilt. It seemed he had started to think of this place as his home. Will stood by the window for a long time, until not a single light remained on in the capital. Only then did he turn his head to look at the bed. Liz was sleeping soundly. He carefully slipped back under the covers, resting his head on her shoulder and gently sniffing the fragrance of her hair. In her sleep, Liz seemed to sense his presence and wrapped her arms around his neck. I've seen you at 8, and I've seen you at 28. I've witnessed your past and your present, and you've been with me as I've grown from a tiny thing to what I am now. I think we're already family. Chapter 67, It's okay to be a little more tired. The next morning, after breakfast, Will coiled his tail around Liz and flew to the gates of the capital. Blaze and the others had already been sent to the Primal Beast Academy. Lan, where are you taking me? We just got back, and I still have so much to do. Liz asked, looking at the back of Will's head in confusion. Will didn't respond. The flight from the palace to the city gates only took 5 minutes. When they landed, Liz looked at the gates behind her with a frown, not understanding. You should go back, Will said, pointing his tail towards the city. Is Lan telling me to go back? Then what about you? Liz understood his meaning but tilted her head, still confused. She felt that something was very, very wrong. It wasn't that Will had never left the capital before, but he had never taken her with him. But today, he had brought her all the way to the gates, only to tell her to go back by herself. The act seemed completely redundant. But Liz felt that Will never did anything without a reason. I'm going to MT Silver, Will said, turning his head to look in its direction. That's the direction of the MT Silver range, Liz said, following his gaze. She paused for a moment, then walked forward and placed a hand on his body. Do you want to go back for a visit, Lan? I'll go with you. There was an uneasy tone in her voice. You've always been so smart, Will thought, looking down at Liz with a smile as he silently shook his head. He knew Liz would figure it out. If he were just going back for a visit, he could have easily gone by himself and returned on the same day. He wouldn't have brought her all the way to the city gates to tell her this, only to send her back alone. Liz felt uneasy, which was why she wanted to go with him. If he agreed, it would mean he wasn't leaving her side, because he couldn't possibly let her stay in MT Silver for long, he would have to escort her back. If he refused, it would mean he was going to be gone for a long time, so long that she wouldn't be able to endure it in the mountain. It could even mean he wasn't coming back at all. Does Lan not like me anymore? Liz asked, the rims of her eyes and the tip of her nose turning a little red, perhaps because of the cold weather. Are you playing the victim with me? Will grinned, seeing right through her act. He remembered when she was a child, she would put on the same pitiful look to get close to him for warmth, only to fall asleep in his arms with a secret, triumphant smile. Why? Tomorrow and accidents, you never know which will come first. You are the queen of the Dragonite Kingdom, and you have great ambitions. I want to have the power to protect you, and even to help you achieve your dreams, Will said, blinking. The leveling speed in the capital was too slow, and the comfortable environment always made him want to slack off. At this rate, it might take him 2 or 3 years to reach his next evolution. In that case, it was better to steel his heart and force himself to go into seclusion in MT Silver for a while. He could also catch a few suitable Pokémon for her while he was there. Will you come back? Liz sighed, stepping forward to wrap her arms around him, looking up at his face. In truth, Liz already knew the answer. She could just feel that he would return to her side. But she still had to ask, to hear the answer her heart needed to be at peace. I will. It won't be long. I promised I would stay by your side. We still have to travel to many places in this world together, Will said, nodding seriously. He extended his tail, and the soft tip brushed against her cheek, wiping away a tiny pearl that had fallen from the corner of her eye. I'll wait for you to come back. Liz raised a hand to wipe her cool cheek. I will nodded again. He leaned down and gently kissed her forehead, then turned and flew into the sky. Be safe, Liz whispered, standing in place and quietly watching his figure fly into the distance. In the sky, Will glanced back, watching the tiny figure gradually disappear from his vision. Liz, you will definitely be the one to change this world. Without enough strength, I can't help you go further. I've never thought of getting stronger for someone else before. But if it's for you, this life, it's okay to be a little more tired. In that moment, Will's gaze was firmer than it had ever been. To be honest, in his 2 lives, he had never really known what he was living for. He was just living for the sake of living, getting stronger for the sake of survival. He was sick of such a meaningless existence. Now, he would get stronger for something he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was to help Liz achieve her dream. Half an hour later, Will arrived at MT Silver, heading straight for the middle ring, a place he had never set foot in either of his lives. He landed. First, find a shelter, then gather food and map the area. I'll probably be staying here for a long time. Will looked at the familiar forest environment and couldn't help but grin. The feeling of his past life as a Beedrill was gradually returning. Rawr! Suddenly, a deafening roar sounded by his ear. He immediately whipped his head around and saw a nearly 4-meter-tall Ursa ring behind him, more than double its Pokédex size. In the outer ring, this would definitely be an alpha. But in this area, it's probably nothing special, right? I'll start by testing the waters with you, Will said, whipping his tail and charging forward. Agility. Focus energy. He closed the distance instantly, then swung an aqua tail at the Ursa ring's belly. The Ursa ring reacted with extreme speed, raising its right arm and swinging down with a full power slash. The claw and tail collided, and both creatures shuddered from the impact. The Ursa ring was clearly the weaker of the two and was knocked back 2 steps by his tail. Strong, Will said, his brow furrowing as his expression grew serious. This Ursa ring's level was probably similar to his own, but its reaction speed was just as fast. The Pokémon that survived in the middle ring of MT Silver were truly no weaklings. If he didn't have the boost from his mystic water, he might have been the one at a disadvantage in that exchange. Roar! The Ursa ring flew into a rage. It raised both arms and charged at him, a pink energy glowing on its claws. A fairy-type move? Will couldn't tell what it was using. But the pink energy, and the uncomfortable feeling it gave him, could only be fairy-type energy. He had no intention of meeting it head-on and flew into the air to dodge. In an unregulated, no-holds-barred wild battle, a Pokémon that can fly is king. Especially against an opponent like Ursaring with few ranged attacks, he would always hold the initiative. Twister. Thunderbolt. Icy Wind. Water Pulse. A barrage of ranged attacks of 4 different types was launched from the air. In that moment, Will was like a turret mage. The Ursaring, unable to hit him and unable to run away, was inevitably beaten down and knocked out, its eyes turning to swirls. After a brief search, Will found the Ursaring's nest. It was a relatively large cave. I'll settle here for now. From this day forward, a seemingly endless daily routine of battle began. Chapter 68, Can you see the snow from where you are? A month had passed in the blink of an eye. The end of the year had arrived. If this world had a calendar, today would be called the winter solstice, a day for everyone to gather and eat dumplings. But unfortunately, no such thing existed in this world, and this day in the capital of the Dragonite Kingdom was no different from any other. In fact, as the weather grew colder, the entire capital seemed to become more deserted, with hardly anyone on the streets. Liz was still buried in work every day, dealing with the increasing number of conflicts between the two kingdoms. Her life seemed unchanged, and yet, it had changed. It had become a bit like the time before Lan appeared in her life, dull and tasteless. Although Blaze and Scorp often played around her, and their antics could occasionally dispel some of the loneliness, her heart was no longer as settled as it used to be. It was like a small boat on the great sea, drifting without an anchor. The feeling Lan gave her was something that all the other Pokémon combined could not replicate. Liz often found it difficult to sleep at night. The boundless darkness was silent and long, enveloping her heart and slowly devouring its warmth. And when she couldn't sleep, she would think about what Lan was doing, how he was molting, whether he was injured. Ha! Breathing out a puff of hot air, Liz stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sky. Ever since the day Lan had left, the sky seemed to have been permanently grey. It's snowing. Liz opened the window and reached her hand out, catching a snowflake in her palm. The moment it touched her skin, it instantly melted into water. The icy temperature seemed to pierce through her skin and into her bones. Liz couldn't help but shiver, pulling the snow-white cape behind her tightly around herself. The cape was soft, just like touching Lan's skin, which brought her a small measure of comfort. Crash! The study door was thrown open. Iris ran in, holding Natty, with the now evolved charm Leon and Scorp chasing boisterously behind her. The little ones crowded around Liz, and the temperature in the study seemed to warm up a little. Be careful now, don't fall, Liz said with a smile, then turned her head again to look out the window, towards the place where the empty silver range lay. This world was strange. Sometimes, it seemed very small. Even after 20 years, lives that were meant to cross would eventually meet again. Other times, it seemed very large. A journey of only a few hours, with no mountains or seas in between, yet you couldn't easily see the people you wanted to see. It's okay even if you don't get stronger. As long as you come back safe and sound. Lady Liz, Hestia said, walking in with a tray in her hands. Yes. The gloves are ready. Hestia held up the tray. On it was a pair of pure white gloves. Liz's eyes lit up. She walked over and put on the gloves she had been thinking about for so long. Their texture was different from the capes. Because they were made from Lan's skin when he was still a Dratini, they were even softer and more delicate. Liz put on the gloves, returned to the window, and reached her hand out again. The pure white gloves looked even purer than the snow. Snowflakes once again landed in her palm, but this time, she felt no cold at all. Even when he's not here, Lord Lan is still doing his best to protect you, Hestia said, standing beside Liz and looking at the snowflake in her palm. Yes, Liz nodded gently. She pulled her arm back and looked up at the sky. Can you see the snow from where you are? The outer edge of the middle ring of MT Silver. Dragon Rush. Will descended from the sky like a blue-purple meteor, crashing straight into the chest of a Nidoqueen. The massive impact sent the Nidoqueen flying back several meters, where it crashed into a tree and fainted. His face purple from poison and his body covered in wounds, Will quickly returned to his cave. He found a pecha berry and swallowed it whole. His complexion gradually improved as the poison was neutralized. So tired, Will said, coiling up in the cave. The physical exhaustion and his injuries were so severe that he hadn't even noticed the weather outside getting colder. He casually ate a few berries that helped with recovery, then closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. He didn't know how much time had passed, but a rustling sound from outside the cave woke him. His eyes snapped open and he rushed out. Behind a large tree, a Machop emerged and beckoned to him with a finger. You again, Will said, looking at the overly confident Machop with a sense of resignation. After more than a month in this area, he had made some old acquaintances. This Machop was one of them. It would come looking for a beating every few days. Another battle began. A few minutes later, having easily secured a victory, Will seemed to notice something. He looked up. A single snowflake drifted down through a gap in the dense canopy and landed on the tip of his nose. It's snowing. Will was stunned for a moment, watching the snowflake gradually melt into water. He stood up and flew above the forest. The clouds were piled up thickly, obscuring the sun, which was why they appeared a cold grey from below. The forest of the MT Silver Range seemed to be covered in a cotton blanket, a world of pure white. I wonder what the capital is like right now. Blaze should have evolved by now. Liz is probably still in her study, dealing with those trivial matters. Will faced the direction of the Dragonite capital. But the distance was too great, no matter how good his eyesight was, he couldn't possibly see dozens of kilometers away. The snowflakes were still drifting down erratically, and many had already landed on his body. A Dragonair's naturally low body temperature made the snow melt very slowly on him. Can you see the snow from where you are? Will floated silently in the air for a while. Soon, it was as if he were wearing a snow-white cape made of snowflakes. He shivered, shook the snow from his body, and quickly flew back down into the forest. As a dragon type, he didn't much like the feeling of snow landing on him. Roar! A roar came from nearby. Will turned his head and saw a giant Nidoking. It had probably come to avenge the Nidoqueen he had defeated yesterday. The moment it saw Will, it charged forward without a word. Will did not back down, whipping his tail to meet the charge. In the middle ring of MT Silver, even if Will didn't proactively seek out battles, other Pokémon would come looking for him. He didn't have a single day of rest. The battle began again. Will had no time to feel sentimental about the arrival of winter, nor did he have a moment to quietly admire the beauty of the Pokémon world's winter. He had to keep fighting, to keep getting stronger. Until the day he felt he could return to her side. Chapter 69, The Fallen Alpha. Winter passed, and spring arrived. Will had no idea how long he had been away from the capital. Judging by his current level, it didn't seem like it had been that long. He felt like he was living the life of a wild man, his days a monotonous cycle of battle, eating, and sleeping. There was nothing else. He had even forgotten the passage of time. Dragonair. Potential, purple. Level, 41. Type, dragon. Ability, shed skin. Height, 10m. Weight, 55 kilograms. Held item, mystic water. Moves, focus energy, inherited, wrap, leer, twister, thunder wave, dragon tail, agility, slam, icy wind, aqua tail, thunderbolt, takedown, water pulse, thunder, brine, dragon rush. Leveling up is getting harder and harder. Will sighed in his cave, his eyes a little unfocused. He had once deliberately tried to count the days. After 7 consecutive days without a single level up, he had given up. Now, he just fought in a daze, day after day. His height and weight had increased a little, with the latter increasing more significantly. Although a 10-meter-long body weighing only 55 kilograms might sound absurd, a Dragonair's body structure was unique, so its appearance was not strange. In fact, according to the proportions in the Pokédex, Will was now a little fatty among Dragonair. If he were to evolve into a Dragonite, he would probably be a bit chubbier than the average one. If this goes on, I might really start to lose my human side. I need to change my lifestyle a bit. Will shook his head vigorously. It had been too long since he had leveled up, and his status screen hadn't changed. As a result, he no longer felt any sense of accomplishment from his victories. Without that positive feedback, his motivation was declining, and his life was starting to feel mechanical. He had to change his current situation. Will flew out of the cave, deciding to take a look around the area. He hoped to find something that would make his life a little different. Swoosh! The moment he poked his head out of the cave, a purple figure shot towards him. It was an Arbok. Will glanced at it, casually halting his advance to dodge its wrap, then fired off a thunderbolt, one-shotting the reckless snake. The middle ring was far more dangerous than the outer ring. Dangers lurked everywhere. In the surrounding forest, you never knew which bush might be hiding a Pokémon, waiting to launch a sneak attack. Over time, Will had gradually developed a kind of danger sense. It was an instinct that didn't appear on his status screen. When danger approached, the scales on his body would spontaneously stand on end to warn him. He glanced at the Arbok on the ground, black smoke rising from its body, then turned and flew away. Fainting in the middle ring was a very dangerous thing. If this Arbok was lucky, it might live. If not, it would probably be eaten by a passing Pokémon. Floating through the massive, lush forest, Will would occasionally look around. He had indeed explored the surrounding area before, but he later found it was useless. The alpha leader of a nearby territory would change every 3 to 5 days. One day it might be a Pinsir, the next it could be an Ursaring. So, he had stopped trying to keep track. He didn't even know whose territory he was in right now. Scy there. Suddenly, a piercing cry came from not far away. Will paused, then immediately changed direction and headed towards the sound. He was out looking for some fun today, it would be a shame not to check out such a commotion. As he got closer, he began to hear the sounds of fighting. He slowed down, moved silently, and carefully approached through the interconnected canopy of the trees. The scene gradually came into view. It was a swarm of Scyther. About 20 or 30 of them had formed a circle, enclosing 2 exceptionally large Scyther in the center. The surrounding trees were either chopped in half, leaving only short stumps, or their trunks were covered in countless slash marks. A battle for leadership, Will thought, immediately understanding the situation. Adding his 2 lives together, he had spent nearly half a year in the wild. He was now quite knowledgeable about the ways of wild Pokémon. Some Pokémon professors from the era of leagues might not even know as much as he did. A Scyther's Pokédex height is 1.5 meters. In this era, they should be between 2.25 and 3 meters. But the two fighting Scyther were both of an exaggerated size. One was the old leader, who seemed a bit aged. Probably because of its alpha status, it was very large, standing a full 4 meters tall. The other was a challenger in its prime, standing 3 meters tall. If it won this battle and obtained the alpha designation, its height would surpass that of the old leader. The new generation replaces the old, Will thought. He only needed a glance to know the outcome of this battle was already decided. The old leader's eye had been slashed and looked to be permanently blind. Although its level was slightly higher than the challenger's, and its ability seemed to be the excellent technician, its reaction time couldn't keep up with the younger Scyther. It's probably because it hasn't fought in a long time, Will thought. He didn't think it was an issue of age. The old leader only seemed old in comparison to the challenger. In reality, it only showed slight signs of aging. In human terms, it might have a few wrinkles or thinning hair, maybe around 40 or 50 years old. A Pokémon's nervous system was very active and didn't decline significantly every few years like a human's. Their reaction time would only start to drop sharply in the last 10 or 20 years of their lifespan. This old Scyther's slow reactions were likely due to having not fought for a long time, which had dulled its combat skills and instincts. Scyther. The outcome was as he expected. The old Scyther was defeated, and it had permanently lost an eye. Under the gaze of all the other Scyther, it had to leave the swarm in disgrace. This was the rule of wild Pokémon swarms, the new leader would not allow the old one to remain. The fact that the new Scyther didn't hunt it down and finish it off was already a sign of mercy. If it had been humans, the old leader would absolutely not have been able to walk off this battlefield today. This area must be ruled by the Scyther clan, Will noted, glancing in the direction the old Scyther had left before turning his gaze to the new leader. Under the watch of all the other Scyther, its height began to climb, finally stopping at a staggering 4.2 meters. Judging by the power fluctuations during the battle, Will estimated the new leader's level to be around 45. Among the many leaders in the middle ring, this was a mid to low tier level. But since this area was still on the very edge of the middle ring, this level was enough for it to rule uncontested here. I should go find that one, Will decided after watching for a moment longer. He quietly slipped away, following the direction the old, defeated Scyther had taken. Chapter 70, Friends. In the dense forest, the Scyther flew forward unsteadily, blood still seeping from the slash across its left eye. It was in extremely poor condition and could lose consciousness at any moment. It had to find a safe place to rest, and fast. This area was close to the outer ring, it wanted to return to its clan's original territory to recuperate for a while. Hey! A voice suddenly came from behind. The Scyther's gaze sharpened, and it spun around, taking a battle stance. When it saw Will, its eyes widened, and the light within them seemed to dim. Its instincts told it that in its current state, it was no match for this behemoth. It was probably going to die here. "Scy, there!" The Scyther hissed, trying to sound threatening in an attempt to scare Will away. "Don't be nervous. I mean you no harm. Scyther. Looking at you now, it'll be hard for you to survive in this forest. I don't know where you're going, but with your injuries, I don't think you'll make it. Why don't you come with me? I'll save you," Will said, standing his ground and staring at the Scyther. In a situation like this, it was best to keep a certain distance, giving the other party the mental space to think. Rushing forward would only startle it, causing it to stop thinking and react rashly. "Scyther? What's your motive?" "Motive? Probably because I've been bored lately," Will frowned, then tilted his head and added after a moment, "Oh, right. Let's try to survive in this forest together from now on." "Scyther," the Scyther hesitated for a moment. It flexed its scythes, a ferocious grin spreading across its face, and then nodded in agreement. "Come with me. My place is close. I have berries there that can help you recover." Will's face lit up with joy. He turned and led the Scyther to his cave. About 10 minutes later, they arrived. "This used to be a bear's territory, but I took it." "Eat this," Will said, pulling a few berries from his food stash and handing them to the Scyther. "Scyther," the Scyther nodded in thanks. Having lived in this forest for decades, it naturally knew that these berries were good for healing injuries. It ate them immediately, and its trust in Will grew. It was not, after all, an inexperienced Pokémon like Blaze or Scorp, it wouldn't trust others so easily. Although it had never left MT Silver, its mind was far more mature than the other two's. Blaze was born in a peaceful forest on the plains where the average power level was low. Scorp was born on an isolated island occupied by its own clan. Neither of them had experienced any real danger or darkness growing up. But this Scyther had been fighting for survival in a perilous ancient forest like MT Silver since it was young. The dozens of scars on its body were all mementos of lessons learned the hard way. It had nearly died at the hands of other Pokémon several times. Their mentalities could not be compared. And this? Grind this grass into a powder and sprinkle it on a wound. It stops the bleeding quickly, Will said, taking out a handful of herbs from a corner. He used his tail to hold a rock and crush the herbs, squeezing out their juices, and then unceremoniously slapped the paste onto the Scyther's left eye. It was a trick he had learned from Liz. Humans were truly efficient at using natural resources, a skill they had learned through generations of trial and error. Scyther. The Scyther was stunned for a moment, then its body began to tremble violently. The pain made it roll on the ground in agony, but after only 2 or 3 seconds, it sat back up, drenched in sweat. Feeling better? Will asked with a smile. He had studied this stuff in his spare time. He had discovered that it was likely the raw material for future items like potions and super potions. In the era of leagues, these were made into convenient, multi-use spray bottles. He remembered in the anime, when Pikachu got a scrape, Brock would spray a potion on it. It would sting at first, but the scrape would heal almost instantly. Scyther, the Scyther nodded. Although it was still in bad shape, it felt much better than before. At least now it didn't have to worry about fainting or dying at any moment. Scyther? The Scyther asked, looking at Will curiously. It didn't seem to have ever seen him, or even a Pokémon like him, in this forest before. Of course, it was also possible that its clan moved around so often that they had simply never crossed paths. I came from outside the forest. I just arrived not long ago, to train and get stronger. Scyther. Yes. I want to protect some people, but I feel my strength is still not enough. Scyther, the Scyther said, indicating it understood. It then began to tell its own story. The more Will listened, the more he admired the Scyther, because it was a lot like him. More accurately, it was a lot like his past self, the Beedrill. When the Scyther was first born, it was in the outer ring of MT Silver. It was all alone, surviving by stealing territory from Caterpie and Weedle. It had been chased by Pidgeotto and Fearow, nearly becoming their food several times. Later, it met other Scyther, conquered them with its strength, and gradually formed a clan. After that, it realized the constant threat from humans in the outer ring and decided to move its entire clan deeper into MT Silver. Although the Scyther told its story concisely, Will knew it must have been an incredibly difficult journey. It must have endured countless hardships to get to where it was. Will had only lived as a Beedrill for a short time, but he had lived cautiously every single day. The Scyther, with its nascent intelligence, would have suffered even more. Aren't you bitter that your position as leader was stolen? Will asked curiously. He couldn't imagine what it would feel like. In his past life, he had died long before any of his subordinates would have had a chance to rebel. Besides, he had Wally. Wally was extremely strong and talented, even stronger than him at the beginning, and second only to him later on. Because Will had saved his life, Wally was fiercely loyal. Any other Beedrill that wanted to usurp his position would first have to consider if they could survive a fight with Wally. SCY, The Scyther lowered its head, a look of resentment in its eye. The results of decades of hard work, how could it be willing to just hand them over to another? It had hoped to one day step down on its own terms, not be beaten and cast out. It's fine. We'll get stronger together, and then we'll go back and kill them. I'll help you. Scyther. The Scyther looked up at Will and then nodded firmly. Scyther. You want to hear my story? All right. It all started when I was in a small lake. Will paused for a moment, then decided there was no harm in telling the Scyther about his current life. And so, in the cave, a Dragonair and a Scyther told each other their stories, sharing the sights they had seen as they had grown. In that moment, Will felt a strange feeling in his heart. He had made his first true friend in this world. The first, and the only one. Their meeting had been a coincidence, born from his boredom, with no other motive. This was different from anyone else he had met. Liz was family, a loved one. Iris, Blaze, and the others were more like juniors, or underlings. Chapter 71, With you and I together, we're invincible, Part 1. Spring passed, and summer arrived. Will had marveled countless times at how correct his decision to save the Scyther had been. The Scyther was an old veteran of MT Silver. It knew at least 80% of the paths in the mountain's middle and outer rings. It remembered which areas were occupied by powerful Pokémon and where rare medicinal herbs and berries grew. Thanks to the Scyther's memories, Will's life these past few months had been much easier. Moreover, they often teamed up to challenge even stronger Pokémon, which had significantly increased his leveling efficiency. Scyther, I'm heading out, Will said, flying to the mouth of the cave and giving his friend a nod. Scyther, the Scyther glanced at him and nodded back. By now, its injuries had long since healed, leaving only its left eye permanently blind. The Scyther's level was very high, even higher than Will's. But since Will hadn't reached that level himself, he couldn't judge accurately. He could only estimate that the Scyther was around LV 46. I'm at level 44. I should be close to evolving soon. Will thought, flying forward with his head down, his attention on his personal status screen. He didn't know how many days he had been away, he only remembered that he had left in the winter, and it was now summer. Many might think that summer is when Pokémon are most active, but that wasn't true. The summer temperatures in MT Silver were ridiculously high, and most Pokémon would hide in the shade of the trees, trying to minimize unnecessary activity to avoid overheating and losing stamina. Perhaps in the Sinnoh region, where the summers were milder, Pokémon would be more active. Will himself didn't even want to leave the cave, let alone other Pokémon. Every time he went out, he could feel the moisture in his body rapidly evaporating, and he still hadn't learned Rain Dance. Boom! Just as Will was pondering how long it would take for him to evolve, a heavy sound echoed from the nearby forest. Will frowned. He recognized it as the sound of some Pokémon's footsteps. But he had been in this area for so long, and he didn't remember any Pokémon nearby that could make such heavy and loud footsteps. Will headed in the direction of the sound to investigate. Unfortunately, by the time he arrived, there were no Pokémon in sight, the creature had likely already left. All he found on the ground was a pair of giant, deeply indented footprints, like those of some monster. It couldn't have jumped down from up there, could it? Will looked up at the cliff face in front of him. It was over 50 meters high. He couldn't imagine what kind of monster could jump down from that height and walk away unharmed. I'll have to remind Scyther when I get back, Will said, giving the footprints one last look before turning to leave. It was another unremarkable day of battle. Will flew wearily towards the cave. Swish! But on his way back, he suddenly heard a familiar sound nearby. That's the sound of a Scyther in battle. Will's eyes widened, and he rushed in the direction of the sound. He had fought alongside the Scyther many times and was familiar with the sound its scythes made when they cut through the air. From this distance and the sound alone, it was clear that the Scyther was not in good shape, the force of its swings had become sluggish. Scyther! Will arrived at the scene at top speed, and one glance was all it took to understand the situation. The Scyther had probably been practicing its skills nearby, you could tell from the slash marks on the surrounding trees. But by a stroke of bad luck, the noise of its practice had attracted its old enemies. It was a swarm composed entirely of Ariados, numbering more than 20. Will had heard the Scyther mention them before. Its old swarm's territory had been close to the Ariados swarms, so they often fought, slaughtering each other over food and land. Because Ariados were weak to the flying type, the Scyther clan had almost always had the upper hand. The Ariados swarm hated them for it, but there was nothing they could do. They couldn't win and could only move their territory. And by coincidence, the place where Scyther was practicing today was very close to the Ariados swarm. The noise had drawn their attention. If it had been any other Pokémon, the Ariados might have just ignored it. But this was the leader of their hated rival. They didn't know that the Scyther had already left its clan, nor why it was here alone. All they knew was that they could not pass up this opportunity to surround and kill it. SCY, there. The Scyther breathed a sigh of relief when it saw Will arrive. Then, its body went limp, and it knelt on one knee, its exoskeleton taking on an unhealthy, pale purple hue. He's badly poisoned, Will thought, looking down at the Scyther's body. He then turned his head to look at the indecisive Ariados. Will's huge size had startled them. With another equally powerful Scyther here, they were hesitating whether to continue the fight. Ariados! The Alpha Ariados commanded. They decided to press the attack and kill the Scyther here and now, to avenge all their past grievances. Scyther! The injured Scyther looked up and pushed at Will, telling him to leave immediately. This was its feud with the Ariados, it didn't want to drag its friend and benefactor into it. Can you still fight? Will asked, scanning the surroundings. He couldn't run. A dozen or so Ariados had already spread out, spinning a great web around them. Even the canopy above was covered in a dense layer of webbing. Ariados silk was famously tough, in the future, it would be highly praised in many regions for its durability. Maybe he could brute force his way through, but he felt there was no need to run. Based on the size of the surrounding Ariados, he judged that none of them were above LV40. In the middle ring, this was the bottom tier, barely able to survive. If not for their superior numbers, allowing them to slowly wear him down, they would never have been able to injure the Scyther to this extent. Scyther, the Scyther gritted its teeth, pushed itself up from the ground, and gave a weak nod. With you and I together, we're invincible, Will grinned, standing back to back with the Scyther as they faced the surrounding enemies. Many of the Ariados were already in bad shape, likely injured by the Scyther earlier. In their current state, Will felt that with him and the Scyther together, taking down this group of spiders would be no problem at all. Scyther, the Scyther glanced around, feeling the support at its back, and nodded. If it didn't have to worry about an attack from behind, then, they could win. Chapter 72, The Tables Have Turned. Aqua Tail. Will made the first move, his long tail whipping out in an instant. The sheer speed and force knocked out two of the smaller Ariados in a flash. Aridos. XN. The other Ariados immediately spat silk at his tail, trying to pin it to the ground before he could retract it. Scyther. The old alpha flashed, his scythes blurring as he used Fury Cutter to slice through the countless strands of silk, which fell harmlessly to the ground. Brine. Will retracted his tail, spun his body, and whipped it around again. A spray of ice blue water scattered in all directions. The Ariados all leaped away, moving quickly across the web they had woven. I was waiting for you to get on the net, Will grinned. A golden light flashed across his body as he unleashed Thunderbolt at one of the Ariados. A normal, dry spider web is not conductive. But Will had just soaked the entire area with brine, making the air in the webs damp. So now, the web was an excellent conductor. Countless currents of electricity spread through the silk threads, branching out towards the other Ariados. A few with quick reactions managed to leap off the web in time, but most were not so fast. More accurately, they lacked the common sense. They didn't realize their own webs could conduct electricity, and by the time they saw the current racing towards their feet, it was too late. If they had a trainer, perhaps they would have been ordered to jump off in time. The Ariados that had jumped down were now in a panic and immediately attacked Will. One used Sucker Punch in a frontal assault. Another used Shadow Sneak to rapidly move behind him, preparing for a backstab. Will whipped his Aqua Tail at the one in front. With his power boost and level advantage, the Ariados stood no chance in a head-on clash and was sent flying, crashing heavily to the ground. At the same time, the Ariados behind him let out a pained cry, green juices spraying from its abdomen as it fell to the ground, motionless. Scyther's form appeared silently behind Will. He stood back to back with his friend, facing the remaining Ariados. Aridos, the Alpha Ariados, sensing defeat, called for a retreat, ordering its underlings to carry the wounded and flee. Will and Scyther did not give chase. They stood their ground, silently watching them retreat into the dark forest until they disappeared from sight. Nice work, Will said with a smile, extending his tail. Scyther paused for a moment, then lifted one of his scythes and tapped it against Will's tail. But the next moment, his expression changed. He lunged forward, and purple bubbles began to foam at his mouth. We need to get you a Pecha berry, fast. Will caught the collapsing Scyther with his tail and immediately flew back towards the cave. Fortunately, he had a habit of stockpiling medicine. Scyther's poisoning was severe, but Will had a huge stash of Pecha berries in the cave. By the time Scyther had eaten so many berries that it was dry heaving, the poison had finally subsided. Scyther, the old alpha said, his first act upon waking to thank Will. He had been saved by him once again. It's nothing. Aren't we friends? Will grinned, not minding at all. Then he remembered something. Oh, right. I found a pair of huge footprints nearby. A really strong guy must have come here from deeper in the mountain. Be careful lately. Scyther nodded grimly, committing the information to memory. Speaking of which, you've recovered your form, and your level is higher than before. Do you want to go back to your swarm and take back your honor? Will asked, gnawing on a berry as he looked at Scyther sitting at the mouth of the cave. Scyther opened its mouth, but no words came out. If you're all better tomorrow, we'll go find that guy. We'll let him know that the tables have turned, and you should never underestimate an old warrior just because he's down on his luck. Will said with a smile, making the decision for him. Although he didn't know what Scyther was hesitating for, based on his understanding of his friend, he knew Scyther definitely wanted to wash away that humiliation himself. Besides, the time has come. The Mantis King has returned. This time, I will take back everything I have lost. Just thinking about it is fun, Will thought. He decided they could take a break tomorrow and go watch the show. Scyther. Scyther turned its head to look at Will. He really didn't understand how Will, who was so young, knew so many strange phrases. Is this how people in human society talked? Oh, it's a long story. I'll have to tell it to you over several days. It's a tale from a faraway land. Will couldn't help but let out a secret smile and began to tell Scyther his own modified version of a famous epic. The protagonist was an old Scyther named Soren. Because he hadn't fought in a long time, his strength had declined, and he was humiliated by his talented fiancée, Lady Alara, from the neighboring forest, who broke off their engagement. But at that very moment, he met a wise and brilliant dragonair alchemist named Alchemist Will. The Scyther was fascinated by the story. But one night wasn't nearly enough to tell it all. Will stopped just as Soren was about to enter the legendary and perilous Wyvern Mountain range. The next day, although Scyther was eager to hear the rest of the story, he knew he had an important battle to fight. Shall we go? Scyther. Scyther nodded, stretching its limbs. He felt that he was now much stronger than when he had first left his clan. During his time with Will, he had listened to a lot of his advice and learned many new techniques. He was now extremely confident that he could beat the new leader senseless. Half an hour later, Will and Scyther arrived at the Scyther clan's current territory. Scyther. A patrolling Scyther recognized its old leader and quickly went to call the new one. Scyther. The new leader frowned as it looked at the old one, then shifted its gaze to Will. It assumed the old leader had brought Will here for revenge. Scyther, the old alpha said, extending an arm to block Will's path as he explained his intentions to the new leader. Scyther, the new leader said, not surprised. This was a normal occurrence in the Pokémon world. If you don't kill the former leader, you have to be prepared for them to challenge you again and again. When the new leader had let the old one go, he had already prepared for this. He calmly accepted the challenge. He was bigger and stronger now than he had been before, he didn't think he would lose. The battle was very fast. The fighting style of the Scyther species was all about speed. In just 10 minutes, the two Alpha Scyther, both around LV45, had decided the winner. And the winner, naturally, was the one who had been specially trained by Will. The situation was the complete reverse of last time. Their levels and physiques were about the same, but this time, the old Alpha's technique was superior. He completely overwhelmed the new leader. After this battle, the old Alpha was basically unharmed. The new leader, however, was now blind in its right eye. The sight made Will's cheek twitch. In all their time together, he had never realized his friend held such a grudge. SCY, the new leader stared blankly, unable to believe it had lost so badly. It stood up, lowered its head, and under the scorching gazes of its former clan mates, prepared to leave. Chapter 73, The Squad Grows. Scyther, the old Alpha spoke, stopping the new leader who was preparing to leave. Scyther. Scyther, Scyther, the old Alpha said a few words, then turned and left. Will glanced at him but didn't say anything, simply following him. The other Scyther, including the new leader, looked at each other, at a loss, and watched their old leader walk away. Having a stronger leader for the clan was, of course, something all the Scyther were happy to see. But they had never expected that after defeating the new leader, the old one wouldn't reclaim his position. Instead, he had just told the new leader to shoulder his responsibilities well, and then left. Scyther. Scyther. From among the 20 or 30 Scyther, 5 who also looked to be quite old, nearing the end of their prime, stepped forward. They waved goodbye to the new leader and then followed in the direction the old one had taken. They hadn't wanted to leave the clan, otherwise, they would have left with him the first time. Their children and descendants were still in this swarm, and staying with so many comrades increased their chances of survival in MT Silver. But just now, watching the battle between the new and old leaders, seeing their old leader's heroic and valiant figure, they were reminded of the memories of following him into battle, long ago. They had been together for decades. Even in the face of great danger, their old leader had never abandoned them. So, now that they had a second chance to choose, they still wanted to follow him, even if it meant starting over from scratch, or dying in battle somewhere. On the other side, why didn't you go back to being the leader? Will asked curiously. He had originally thought about living with the Scyther clan as a guest elder or something. That way, he would never have to waste time gathering food again, and he wouldn't have to sleep with one eye open at night. However, he wasn't too surprised by his friend's decision. It was like in the story he had told him, after the hero got his revenge, he didn't go back to thinking about his old fiancée. Scyther, the old alpha shook his head, his figure looking a little lonely. He had only wanted to wash away the humiliation of his defeat and show his clan that he was still the strongest. As for the position of leader, he had gradually let go of it over these past few months. Opportunities should be left for the young. He was not young anymore. At his age, it was difficult to improve his strength, and in a few years, it would even begin to decline. The new leader was still in his prime, the peak of a Pokémon's strength. He still had a long time to grow and would one day surpass him and defeat him again. Rather than waiting to be defeated once more then, it was better to be graceful today and proactively give up the position, demonstrating his magnanimity. Hey, a few of your clan are following us. Your old partners, right? Will noticed the Scyther catching up behind them. Judging by their appearance, they were clearly not young, perhaps even a bit older than the one beside him. Scyther, the old alpha said, turning his head. Those were the companions who had fought their way with him from the outer ring of MT Silver into the middle ring. Scyther, Scyther, the other Scyther said, catching up and explaining their intentions. They wanted to continue to follow their old leader. Scyther. The old alpha frowned. He didn't look happy, but instead turned to ask for Will's opinion. He was no longer alone, he had to consider his new companion's thoughts. Isn't it a good thing to let them join? This way, what happened yesterday won't happen again, Will said. He thought it was a great idea. He had always been a firm believer in strength in numbers. From his past life as a Beedrill building a clan, to this life catching Pokémon for Liz. He had even thought about finding some underlings for himself in MT Silver, but the problem was he couldn't find any other Dragonair or Dratini, and the other species in the middle ring all had their own swarms. That was why he had been all alone until he met the Scyther, who had also become a loner. Now, their 2-man squad could expand to a 7-man squad. This was a great thing, there was no reason to refuse. In the future, when he came home exhausted after a day of battling, he wouldn't have to maintain such a high level of alertness and could finally get some proper rest. Scyther, the old alpha looked at them, then nodded. By a strange twist of fate, he had become a leader again, only this time, the clan was very small. But this small was only in the context of the era of primal beasts. In the future, not just the Scyther clan, but many other Pokémon swarms would shrink. As the pressure of survival drastically decreased, there was no longer a need for them to band together. With their naturally strong racial advantages, they could live comfortably alone and were no longer willing to submit to others. This is why in the future, humans would rarely see Scyther in groups outside of mating season. In the wild, a squad of 3 Scyther was already a rare sight. Most of them acted alone. Of course, there might have been other, unknown reasons for this. Back at the Scyther swarm's territory, a major event was unfolding. Scyther. Many of the Scyther looked at their new leader with expressions of disbelief. Scyther, the new leader had made up his mind. Ignoring the protests of his clan mates, he turned and left alone. He believed that the old leader had become so strong because of the growth that came from acting alone. Today's defeat had left him extremely unwilling to accept his weakness. So, he decided to emulate the old leader, to go out and survive on his own, using pressure to force himself to become stronger. Scyther. 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 The other Scyther were suddenly left without a leader. They stood around in a daze, looking at each other. Gradually, some of the more ambitious Scyther left on their own. They thought the new leader had a point and wanted to learn from the old leader's example and survive alone. It might be difficult, but without difficulty, how could one become stronger? The number of clan members gradually dwindled. The remaining weaker and more timid Scyther didn't dare to act alone, so they formed small squads of 2 or 3 and scattered. A change had begun, starting with this one Scyther clan. Over the next 1,000 years, the Scyther that scattered today would gradually change the nature of all Scyther in the Johto region, and even the world. But setting aside the future for a moment, just when Will thought the day's excitement was over, something he had never expected happened. Will and the 6 Scyther stood in the cave, staring at a loss for words at what was inside. Know what kind of deadbeat parent leaves their egg on my bed? Chapter 74, The Abandoned Egg. Will lay in the large, soft grass nest, his coiled body wrapped around a blue egg. This is not my egg. Will looked angrily at the 6 Scyther who were gathered around, staring at him. Probably because the egg's color was similar to his own and had appeared in his nest, the Scyther all thought it was his. But Will was a male. And his preference wasn't for Pokémon. Unless it was a Gardevoir or a Meowscarada. Some people who aren't familiar with the new grass-type starter might not understand. How could a mere Meowscarada compare to the great Gardevoir? But the reality is that in a certain popularity poll where both game and anime fans participated, Meowscarada ranked number 1, while Gardevoir fell to 10th place. Of course, although the newcomer Meowscarada won this time, it will ultimately not be a match for the hegemon, Gardevoir. This was, after all, just a small poll. If all the fans in China were to vote, Gardevoir's rank would absolutely be above Meowscarada's. But it's undeniable that Meowscarada is also a very charming Pokémon that appeals to the aesthetic of many furry fans. If it were a Gardevoir or a Meowscarada, then maybe Will would consider having an egg. But the problem was, where in the Kanto or Johto region would he find one? The era of primal beasts was not the future, travel between regions was extremely inconvenient. If Kanto and Johto weren't connected, it would be difficult for the people of the Dragonite and Land Kingdoms to even meet, let alone see Pokémon from other regions. Scyther, Scyther! The old alpha waved its scythes. Having been with Will for so long, it naturally knew he didn't have a mate. This egg had truly just appeared in their cave, in the short time they were away. Hearing their old leader's words, the other Scyther finally nodded in understanding. But the question remained, what to do with the egg? You guys go gather some berries nearby for today. Maybe the child's parents will come back. I'll stand guard here. Besides, with more of us now, the food we had collected isn't enough anymore, Will said, looking at the group of Scyther. Say what you will, they might be old, but not a single one of them was weak. The youngest had lived for more than 40 years and had reached a level of around 40. 40-something years old and only LV40 might seem pathetic compared to Will, who had reached LV44 in less than a year in this life. But it all depends on the comparison. From the perspective of a wild Pokémon, this was really not bad at all. These Scyther had some ambition, they had fought constantly in their youth all the way to the middle ring before settling down and relying on natural growth to raise their levels. And in this era, Pokémon sometimes had no choice but to fight for food and territory. So, the average level of wild Pokémon was naturally higher than in the era of leagues. Think about the peaceful and comfortable era of leagues in the future. Pokémon rarely had to fight to the death over food. At most, they would fight over territory, and even then, they would stop when a clear winner emerged. Even if a fight got heated, it might be stopped by some righteous, meddling Pokémon like Ash's Bulbasaur or Turtwig, or by a Pokémon ranger or an old man or woman living nearby. Under those conditions, how could they gain experience through battle? So, the average level of wild Pokémon in the era of leagues would only be lower. For example, the Trico herd that Ash met when he first arrived in the Hone region. The patriarch of that herd had lived for who knows how many hundreds of years and was still a Trico, his body stooped and his face full of wrinkles. He had probably never been in a single battle since he was born, relying entirely on natural growth. This also showed just how slow natural growth was. At Will's current level, if he wanted to level up just by natural growth, it might take him decades, or even a century. So, from a wild Pokémon's perspective, the levels of these Scyther were not low for their age. With a group like this staying in the cave, Will figured that even if the egg's parents returned, they wouldn't dare to enter. So he had to send them away first. Scyther, the old alpha nodded and led the other 5 out of the cave. Although it wasn't a natural-born genius, having lived for so long, its mind was a bit sharper than the average Pokémon's. It had guessed Will's true intention and would lead the others to circle the nearby area. If a fight broke out at the cave, it could lead them back at a moment's notice. And so, Will was left alone in the cave, holding the egg and waiting. A Dragonair's abdomen is very soft. Holding the egg close, he could feel its warmth. He could even seem to sense a little something moving inside. It's not going to hatch, is it? Will looked down at the egg with a bad feeling. He was worried that when the child hatched, it would imprint on him as a parent and cling to him. Will did not want to be saddled with a little burden in the middle ring of empty silver. It was easy to imagine the dangerous situations he would be forced into because of this little thing. But to just throw away or eat this innocent, helpless Pokémon egg, he couldn't bring himself to do it. The human soul is a bit like a cat's. It has more patience and tolerance for the old, the weak, and the young. Will could abandon a heavily injured, strange adult Pokémon without batting an eye, but he couldn't turn a blind eye to a powerless egg like this, just as he hadn't been able to ignore the young Liz when she had wandered into empty silver. As the sky gradually darkened, Will's mood soured. The egg's parents still hadn't appeared. What kind of normal parents would leave their child in another beast's nest for a whole day? Even humans wouldn't do such a thing, let alone the more emotional Pokémon. Will guessed that the child's parents were probably on the brink of death. As a last resort, they had left their child in his nest. Perhaps they had been secretly observing him for the past few days and discovered that he was a good Pokémon who fights but doesn't kill, which was why they had chosen to take a gamble and leave the egg with him. Finding foster parents for one's child is a very common occurrence in the animal kingdom. Therefore, it was also a common occurrence among Pokémon, who were designed based on animals. In the future era of leagues, it often happened that wild Pokémon, unable to care for their children or hoping they would receive better training, would leave their young to be raised by humans. But in this era, Pokémon didn't yet trust humans. So, they would observe and choose other friendly and kind Pokémon to be the foster parents. Generally, Pokémon like Kangaskhan, Miltank, and Chansey would be chosen. Looks like I really do have to take you with me. Will looked at the mouth of the cave and sighed helplessly. The figures of the Scyther, carrying large amounts of berries, were already appearing. The day was almost over. Scyther? The old Alpha asked, looking at the egg when he returned. Yes. It seems we'll be the ones to raise this child from now on. Scyther the old Alpha smiled and patted its chest. It was actually quite happy about the new life that was about to join their group. It didn't have much to do besides training anyway, it had plenty of time to take care of a baby. Most Pokémon, in fact, feel joy and excitement at the birth of a new life. They are simple and don't overthink things like Will does. Chapter 75, The Little Blue Fuzzball. The next day, just as Will had expected, the egg he had been keeping was about to hatch. Scyther? The old Alpha asked, looking expectantly at the Pokémon egg, which was now flashing in Will's embrace. The other 5 Scyther had gathered around to watch, whispering amongst themselves and guessing what kind of Pokémon it would be. It will probably be born today, Will said, observing the frequency of the flashing. He estimated that the egg had probably started flashing sometime last night while they were all asleep. A Pokémon egg will begin to rhythmically flash with a white light in the 24 hours before it hatches. The frequency of the flashing increases as time goes on. To be honest, Will didn't really want to stay here right now. But he had to be the one to watch over it. The Scyther's arms were sharp scythes, they couldn't even do something as basic as holding an egg, let alone take care of a newborn Pokémon. Even within their own clan, Scyther would not easily touch their own eggs or infant stage young. They would typically place the eggs or babies in a grass nest and let them play and grow on their own. Only after the baby Scyther had left its infant stage and its exoskeleton had begun to harden would they engage in more intimate interactions with their children. It was a good thing that the Scyther species was not one that required a lot of care. If it had been an Eevee, a Togepi, or a Smoochum Pokémon that are extremely needy, they would have died from neglect in a Scyther clan. Time passed, and it was gradually getting to be afternoon. The Scyther had gone to the nearby forest to sharpen their scythes. This daily training helped them maintain their sharpness so their combat ability wouldn't decline. Will stayed in the cave alone, swishing his tail in frustration. The temperature of the egg in his arms was gradually rising, and the frequency of its flashing was also increasing. Suddenly, the light became continuous. The entire egg was glowing like a light bulb. Will immediately lifted his head. He knew the egg was about to hatch. The oval-shaped egg began to change shape, and the blinding light started to dim. Zubat! Pat, pat! A strange cry came first, followed by the sound of something slapping against the ground. Hey? This is... Will squinted, waiting for the light to dissipate, and then he got a clear look at the little one in his arms. A Zubat! A Zubat with a height of only 0.4 meters was truly tiny. Like a Gligar, half of its height was in its tail. From head to rear, it was only about 20 centimeters long. Because it was a newborn, its height was only half the Pokédex standard. It would likely grow to far exceed that value in the future. Zubat have no eyes, they rely on ultrasonic waves to detect their surroundings. At this moment, the Zubat was emitting sound waves to perceive the environment in the cave and Will's own presence. A Zubat, hey! Will looked down at the not exactly handsome little thing and fell into deep thought. The final evolution of the Zubat line is Crobat. If you were to ask what Crobat is most famous for, it would have to be its unique poison and flying type combination. Gliscor's flying and ground typing is unique among all non-legendary Pokémon. If you include them, you have to add Landorus. But Crobat's typing is truly, absolutely unique. Even including legendary and ultra beasts, there is no other with this combination. And this typing is quite strong. It's 2x weak to 4 types, with no 4x weakness. It 4x resists 3 types, 2x resists 2 types, and is immune to ground. To have such a defensive profile without the steel type is extremely good. Crobat has a base stat total of 535, which is very high among ordinary Pokémon, even 10 points higher than a fully evolved starter. Its most outstanding feature is its speed, with 130 points allocated to that stat, only 15 points lower than a Mega Beedrill. But those were its only advantages. Its other 5 stats were extremely balanced, and balance is not always a good thing. Crobat was a classic glass cannon without the cannon. In Generation 7 and earlier, Crobat was a superb utility Pokémon. Its high speed gave it a good niche, making it a popular choice on the competitive scene. But after Generation 8, with the appearance of ultra-fast Pokémon like Regieleki, formerly fast Pokémon like Crobat began to be outclassed and gradually lost their place in the meta. But that was all from a game perspective. From a practical, real-world perspective, a Crobat was definitely a Pokémon worth raising. The biggest difference between reality and the games is that battles are not turn-based. High speed and high mobility is strength. In the time it takes a Beedrill to attack once, a Crobat might have already launched its third attack. Not only could it attack multiple times in a row, but it could also greatly increase its evasion rate, allowing it to dodge moves that were marked as 100% accuracy in the games. You could see this from how Ash especially loved to train his Pokémon's speed. He was so focused on speed that during his Sinnoh journey, he trained his Turtwig, a Pokémon with great potential as a defender, in the wrong direction, causing it to suffer for a long time after it evolved into Grotle. Famous trainers like Brock, Janine, and even Giovanni had all raised a Crobat. Zubat. The Zubat seemed to have now perceived and memorized Will's presence, accepting him in its heart as its most important family member. "Hello there, little one," Will sighed, lowering his head to gently touch the little blue fuzzball. Although becoming this Zubat's foster parent was not his intention, and he had been reluctant to take on this little burden, there was nothing more to be said now. Since he had accepted this responsibility by a twist of fate, he would do his best to raise this little one. And then, dump it on Liz to raise. Bat the Zubat snuggled against Will's abdomen and let out a pitiful little cry. "Hungry? How about you try sucking on this?" Will looked at the 4 tender baby teeth in the Zubat's mouth, then frowned and took out a soft-skinned berry. He was a little at a loss as to how to raise this kind of Pokémon. The Zubat line was different from others. Wild Zubat basically survive by sucking the blood of animals or other Pokémon. Their blood-sucking ability is quite formidable, their fangs can pierce a prey's body without the prey even feeling any pain, so it's not discovered right away. Although domesticated Zubat will eat specially made food or even solid objects, a newborn like this one clearly couldn't eat something like a berry. Its teeth were too small and couldn't handle the job of chewing. Will could only try to get the Zubat to suck the juice from the berry. Chapter 76, The Timid Zubat. Zubat. The Zubat took a bite of the fruit, but its teeth couldn't even break the skin. The effort made the little one yelp in pain and pull its head back, burying it in Will's stomach. Will took the berry back, silent for a moment. He hadn't expected a newborn Zubat to be unable to pierce even this kind of fruit skin. He thought for a moment, then took a small bite out of the berry himself. "Try again," Will said, holding the now bitten fruit to the Zubat's mouth. Zubat. Sib. The Zubat's teeth couldn't get through the skin, but they could sink into the soft flesh inside. It could finally start sucking the juice. The little one's stomach was as small as its body. After drinking the juice from about 3 or 4 berries, it stopped and leaned against Will, looking like it was about to fall asleep. What am I going to do? I can't stay here forever, Will thought, looking down at the Zubat and then out of the cave. The summer sun was scorching. The Zubat species makes its home in dark caves, sleeping upside down during the day. They stay in dark places because their skin is so thin that it gets sunburned if exposed to sunlight. Therefore, Will could basically forget about taking the Zubat out to train during the day. And there was another problem. For the next few days, at least until it was out of its infant stage, the Zubat would surely refuse to leave his side. Does this mean I have to train at night? I'm not used to being active at night. Will lay helplessly in his nest. He decided it was best to wait for the Scyther crew to return. If the Zubat wasn't hostile towards them, then he could leave it in their care. As evening approached, the sixth Scyther returned, looking a little tired. Because they had experienced the consequences of declining strength firsthand, the old alpha was now training very hard, which in turn motivated the other 5. Counting Will, this cave was now the base for 7 Pokémon between LV40 and LV46. A team of this strength could already start exploring the deeper parts of the middle ring. In any case, Will now had to go deeper to find suitable opponents for training. There were very few left in the outer parts of this zone. Scyther. When the Scyther returned and saw the Zubat curled up in a ball in Will's embrace, they all gathered around, excited and surprised. They stood in a circle, looking down and squinting, trying to get a good look at the tiny fuzzball. For the Scyther, who were all around 3 meters tall, the Zubat, curled into a 0.2 meter ball, was like a small toy. Zubat. The Zubat was woken by the noise and lifted its head from Will's embrace. Because it had no eyes, it wasn't immediately frightened by the sixth Scyther. Zubat. It was only after it released an ultrasonic wave and received the feedback that the Zubat was terrified. It flapped its wings in a panic, trying to burrow deeper into Will's body. All right, they're not bad guys, Will sighed, raising his tail to gently wrap around the Zubat. He figured this little one's nature must be timid. If the game's nature mechanics also worked in reality, then this Zubat would have a talent for speed, but would be at a disadvantage in physical attacks. But Will thought that was unlikely. Once you were in the real world, you'd find that many of the rules from the games were completely wrong. Zubat. Enveloped by Will's large tail, the Zubat immediately felt safe and gradually calmed down. It cautiously sent out more ultrasonic waves, observing the presence of the large creatures around it. Next, under Will's intentional guidance, the Scyther skillfully used their scythes to chop the berries into a fine mash, which they then fed to the Zubat for its dinner. The Zubat could, of course, eat the fruit now that it was a paste, and this act immediately raised its affection for the Scyther crew. Night fell. Will was planning to go to sleep, but the Zubat, having slept all day, was wide awake. The little one seemed to know it shouldn't disturb Dad's sleep, but as a newborn full of energy, it couldn't help but fidget. This, in turn, kept Will, who was always highly alert in the wild, from being able to sleep. Oh, fine. I'll take you out for a walk. Let you see the world, Will sighed. He placed the little Zubat on his head, stood up, and flew out of the cave. The nights in MT Silver had a charm all their own. It wasn't peaceful and serene like the forest where he had met Blaze, it was filled with a tense and exciting atmosphere. Because the sun was too fierce and the temperature too high during the summer days, the Pokémon had all shifted their activities to the night. Even though Will was just circling the area around his own cave, he could hear the sounds of battle from at least several hundred meters away. In any case, Will didn't want to be active at night. Although a Dragonair had some night vision, it wasn't very strong, and it was easy to get ambushed. And ever since his first life as a Beedrill, he had never gotten used to being active at night, so he had very little night combat experience. Zubat. The Zubat sat obediently on Will's head, using its ultrasonic waves to sense its surroundings. Will just quietly took it for a stroll, letting it get familiar with the environment. From now on, you'll sleep soundly in the cave during the day. Don't come out by yourself. Stay with the Scyther crew. I'll often be out during the day, but I'll come back to be with you at night. Zubat, Zubat. Although it was just a baby, it was an obedient baby. But while it obediently agreed, it used its wings to hug one of Will's feathery head wings, expressing its reluctance to be separated. When you grow up and get your eyes, you can come out with me. I'll take you to see the world outside this forest and introduce you to other friends, Will comforted the Zubat. When a Zubat evolves into a Golbat, it grows eyes, and its body becomes stronger. Although it still won't like the daytime, it won't get sunburned anymore. Zubat, the Zubat nodded obediently, looking forward to that day. It wanted to grow eyes. Not to see the world, but because it wanted to see Will. Alright, should we go back? It's better for you to get a lot of sleep. It's good for your development. Zubat, hearing that sleep would help it grow, the Zubat immediately nodded. It would sleep with all its might. To grow up fast. Chapter 77, The Devastated Kangaskhan Mother. Time flew by, and autumn arrived. MT Silver transformed from a uniform lush green to a kaleidoscope of colors. It was like a breathtaking painting, even time itself had put on a richer palette. Golden fallen leaves and branches laden with red, yellow, and green berries adorned the forest's attire. The summers and winters in MT Silver were relatively quiet, but the springs and autumns were exceptionally lively, especially in autumn, when the variety of fruit was at its peak and the temperature and humidity were most suitable. Boom! A loud crash from outside the cave woke Will and the others from their sleep. It was the sound of a tree being knocked over. Starting this early in the morning. Let's see which suicidal fool it is, Will said, opening his eyes in annoyance. He had been living in this cave for nearly a year now. By all rights, the surrounding wild Pokémon should know that a not-to-be-messed-with character lived here. Although Will himself didn't have a strong sense of territory, the local Pokémon had basically tacitly acknowledged this area as his turf. Normally, no one would dare to come here and cause trouble. Zubat. The Zubat also opened its eyes groggily, having been woken by the noise. It still hadn't evolved, mainly because Will had rarely taken it out to battle. One reason was that it was hard to find low-level opponents suitable for it in the middle ring. The other was that this Zubat had been raised improperly. A normal Zubat sleeps during the day and goes out at night. But Will's Zubat insisted on keeping the same schedule as him, so it had become nocturnal, sleeping at night and playing by itself in the cave or under the shade of nearby trees during the day. It still couldn't be directly exposed to sunlight, so Will could only take it to the outer ring to train on rainy days when the sun wasn't as strong. This had naturally led to it not having evolved after 2 or 3 months. From a human perspective, this speed was a bit slow, as a Zubat only needed to reach around LV22 to evolve. But from a wild Pokémon's perspective, its leveling speed was still far ahead of the curve. The Zubat's current level was around 20, its length was a normal 1.6 meters, and its weight was 20 kilograms, which already made it a fat bat for its species. You stay in the cave. I'm going out to see, Will instructed the Zubat, then flew outside. The Scyther crew wasn't in the cave, they were probably out for their morning training. Zubat, the Zubat nodded obediently and stayed put in its nest. When Will got outside, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. It was too quiet. Just a moment ago, the forest had been noisy, but now it had suddenly fallen silent, like a scene from a horror movie. Moreover, because of his overly benevolent style, his cave was usually surrounded by many small, weak Pokémon seeking shelter. It should never have been this quiet. Looks like a powerful Pokémon has come, Will murmured, opening his status screen for a look. Dragonair. Potential, purple level, 47. Type, Dragon ability, Shed Skin. Height, 10m. Weight, 55 kilograms. Held item, Mystic Water. Moves, Dragon Rush, Safeguard. He had reached LV47 and learned Safeguard a while ago. It was safe to say he no longer had any rivals in the outer parts of the middle ring. Even the alphas of other species with similar levels were no match for him. He felt that even if a strong opponent showed up, it shouldn't be a problem. He wasn't even afraid of some of the alphas from the deeper parts of the middle ring. Thump. Thump. Heavy footsteps drew closer. Will saw a huge figure slowly approaching him through the forest. A Tyranitar? From its silhouette, it looked a bit like Godzilla, and the first Pokémon that comes to mind when you think of Godzilla is Tyranitar. Oh crap, this thing definitely came from deeper in, Will thought as he got a clearer look. It wasn't a Tyranitar, but a Kangaskhan that stood 5 meters tall. A Pokédex Kangaskhan is 2.2 meters, so one from this era should be between 3.3 and 4.4 meters. This one's height had already surpassed the normal range. A long life doesn't necessarily guarantee a huge physique. If a Pokémon lives a long time but lacks nutrition, its size might even shrink. Only great strength can allow a Pokémon to break through its normal size limits. Of course, there was also the possibility that it was both old and strong. This is bad. Will felt his scalp tingle as he looked at the Kangaskhan. It wasn't just because of its potential strength, but more importantly, because the pouch on its belly was empty. There were only two possibilities. 1. The baby had reached the age of 3 and it was time for it to leave its mother. Or 2. The baby was lost or dead. Gulp. Will swallowed hard, looking at the Kangaskhan's bloodshot eyes, which were already showing cracks. It was clearly the latter. This would cause a mother Kangaskhan to go berserk, to the point where she wouldn't even fear death. The one before him was clearly on the verge of a complete breakdown. Wait, those giant footprints from before. Will suddenly remembered the giant footprints he had seen at the bottom of a cliff months ago. He had known then that some monster had come out from deeper in the mountain. But since nothing had happened for 2 or 3 months, he had assumed it had gone back. It seemed now that the monster was this Kangaskhan mother who had lost her child. And for the past few months, she must have been searching for it. Roar! The moment the Kangaskhan saw Will, it lunged, ramming its headbutt towards him. This thing has really lost it, Will thought, pushing off with the lower half of his body to launch himself into the air, dodging the attack. The Kangaskhan had clearly become neurotic, attacking any Pokémon it saw. Roar! The Kangaskhan glared at the airborne Will, then ignored him and turned to leave. This action made Will realize that perhaps it wasn't as dangerous as he thought. At least it wouldn't chase down and kill a Pokémon that actively fled. That made sense. If it had been on a killing spree, the outer middle ring would have been littered with corpses by now. But then, the Kangaskhan's path made Will's face darken. It was heading straight for his cave. She was going to see if her baby had run in there. Bzzzt. Suddenly, a powerful bolt of electricity shot down from the sky, striking the Kangaskhan. The Kangaskhan gritted its teeth, turned to look at the dangerous blue serpent in the sky, and decided to deal with this nuisance first. That cave is my territory. Get lost, Will said. He didn't want to fight this Kangaskhan, he estimated that he most likely couldn't win. But the Zubat was still in that cave. He couldn't let this rabid dog enter. Roar! The Kangaskhan couldn't understand a word he was saying. In its eyes, Will was just a villain trying to stop her from finding her child. Rock slide! The Kangaskhan drew back its arms, a brown energy gathering in its palms. In an instant, several huge rocks materialized behind her, which she then hurled at Will. Water pulse! Will shot a spiraling orb of water from his mouth. The orb exploded in midair, sending out waves that struck the incoming rocks. The waves weren't powerful enough to shatter the rocks, but the impact was enough to knock them off course, causing them to fly past Will without harming him. This thing! Will frowned, feeling that this was going to be tough. This Kangaskhan was not only powerful, but its move pool also seemed to be quite deep. A rock-type move like Rock Slide was not something a Kangaskhan could learn through natural growth. It must have learned it through countless battles with rock-type opponents. Will had originally planned to use his air superiority to act as a mage and take it down, like he did with the Ursa Ring, since a Kangaskhan's natural move list didn't have many ranged attacks. But now it seemed that wouldn't work. Seeing its first attack fail, the Kangaskhan immediately followed up. It stomped one foot heavily on the ground, and a series of tall rock pillars suddenly erupted from the earth. Rock tomb! Crash! Will wasn't flying high enough and couldn't dodge the huge rocks that shot up from below him. Not good. A heavy blow to his abdomen made his body stiffen for a moment. With no time to think, Will felt the Kangaskhan's presence rapidly approaching and tried to gain altitude to create distance. But to his shock, the Kangaskhan stepped on one of the rock pillars and leaped an incredible 17 or 18 meters into the air. So fast! Will looked up in shock at the Kangaskhan now above him and subconsciously gulped. At the same time, the scales all over his body stood on end, and he instinctively whipped his aqua tail upwards. This is bad. When Will saw the Kangaskhan raise its arm high above, its fist glowing with an ice blue light, he knew he was in for a world of pain. He had thought it would use a move more suited to its high position, like Stomp. He had never expected it to use one of the few moves that could hit a dragon type for super effective damage, Ice Punch. Chapter 78, With You and I Together, We're Invincible, Part 2. What is with this Kangaskhan? The thought had barely formed in his mind when the Kangaskhan's fist smashed his tail aside and slammed into his abdomen. Boom! Dust and debris flew up as a massive crash echoed through the forest. It was the sound of Will being knocked out of the sky. How does this Kangaskhan know that ice is super effective against dragon? And On what basis did she even think I was a dragon type? Will gritted his teeth, a pained expression on his face as he climbed up from the ground, his mind filled with confusion. Pokémon generally have no concept of types. Just like when a trainer orders a Pokémon to use a move against a type-resistant opponent, they don't question it. It's like when Ash told Pikachu to use an electric-type move on an Onix, Pikachu was surprised when its attack had no effect. Could it really be a coincidence? Or did she learn from past battles? Will still felt it was impossible for the Kangaskhan to understand type matchups. And he had no time to think about it. That punch had nearly taken half his life. His own powered-up water-type move hadn't been able to stand against her fist for even half a second. This Kangaskhan's level had to be 55 or higher. Water pulse. Will looked up and saw the Kangaskhan falling rapidly. He seized the moment when she couldn't dodge and shot a spiraling orb of water from his mouth. This time, the Kangaskhan could only cross her arms and block. Bang! The water orb exploded against her, merely causing a few scrapes on her arms. This isn't going to work. I'll have to lure her away and then run. Scyther! Just as Will was preparing to disengage, the sound of his friend's cry rang out. He turned and saw the 6 Scyther rushing over, already using Swords Dance as they moved. This was a technique Will had taught them, to use self-buffing moves while on the move. Although they had looked ridiculous at first, often crashing into trees, they had eventually mastered it. Looks like I don't have to run, Will said, sighing in relief. If they could defeat this Kangaskhan, that would be the best outcome. Otherwise, even if he led her away today, she would just come back tomorrow, and they would be forced to move. After living here for nearly a year, Will had no intention of relocating. Scyther, the old alpha said, arriving at Will's side and asking about his condition. He had heard the commotion and first returned to the cave. After confirming the Zubat was safe and Will was out, he had rushed over, only to find Will fighting the behemoth. It's the one from deeper in the mountain. Its head's not right. Be careful. Scyther. Of course we're fighting. With you and I together, we're invincible. Besides, there are so many of us now. Let's swarm her. In that moment, Will rediscovered the feeling of being the alpha Beedrill. If you can't win a one-on-one fight, call your underlings and beat them down as a group. There was another point Will didn't mention, mainly because the Scyther wouldn't have understood. All 6 of them knew fighting type moves, and fighting was the only type super effective against the normal type Kangaskhan. Scyther, the old alpha nodded. Since Will had decided to fight, he had nothing more to say. Even if this Kangaskhan looked terrifyingly strong, even if it seemed to have come from the very center of MT Silver. Will had already said it. With the 2 of them together, they were invincible. I'll draw her fire. You all use focus energy and then brick break. Will yelled, charging forward with agility. This Kangaskhan was tough and high level. It would take a huge effort for him to defeat her with his own moves. So, in this battle, he had to play support and let the Scyther use their type advantage to land a super effective blow. Scyther. The 6 Scyther nodded in unison and moved as one. As old comrades who had fought together in MT Silver for over 40 years, their coordination was perfect. Roar! The Kangaskhan had clearly gone mad. Seeing so many Pokémon attacking her at once, her first thought was not to run, but to take them all down with her. She opened her mouth, and an ice blue light appeared within. Then, a beam of cold energy shot towards the flying Will. Ice beam! The Kangaskhan had decided to eliminate this villain who was obstructing her from finding her child. This thing, it really does know that ice-type moves are super effective against me. Seeing that beam, Will was now completely certain. Once could be a coincidence. Twice was impossible. And both times, the ice-type moves were aimed directly at him. Even in this crazed state, the Kangaskhan remembered to use ice-type moves against him. This was extremely unreasonable. Twister. He casually whipped his tail, sending a small blue-purple tornado forward. The Twister couldn't stand against the ice beam, but it could momentarily block it, buying him time to dodge. Will twisted his body and approached from the side. The Kangaskhan seemed to have anticipated this. It lowered its head and charged towards him. Another headbutt. This time, Will didn't plan to dodge. A head-on collision was out of the question, but to create an opening for the Scyther, he had to be reckless. Icy wind. First, he spat out a blast of frigid, ice crystal-laden wind. The wind scraped across the Kangaskhan, dealing minimal damage. But he wasn't trying to do damage, his real purpose was to use the icy wind to stiffen the Kangaskhan's muscles, making his next move a success. Then, Will charged forward, taking the full force of the headbutt. At the same time, he used wrap, tightly binding the Kangaskhan. The advantage of his large size was now apparent. Even a massive Kangaskhan like this was coiled 4 or 5 times by his body. If an Arbok had tried this, it would have looked like a belt. Roar! The Kangaskhan struggled with all its might, the force almost tearing Will's body apart. But even so, he held on tight. Seeing that it couldn't break free, the Kangaskhan decided to attack. Crunch! It opened its mouth, a dark brown energy appearing on its teeth, and bit down on Will's body. Its sharp fangs instantly pierced his blue scales and sank deep into his flesh. A sharp pain shot through him, and despite his best efforts, a pained cry escaped his throat. Thunder! In this state, Will also chose to attack. This powerful electric-type move, which had low accuracy in the games, was 100% accurate when used in a bind. He had already tested this many times. Bzzzzzt. An extremely dazzling electric light flashed from Will's body, shooting a bolt of lightning into the sky. The next moment, the lightning fell from above like a golden meteor and struck the Kangaskhan on the head. The shock left its brain buzzing. The Pokémon was instantly paralyzed and its jaw went slack, releasing its bite. At the same time, the sixth Scyther, buffed with focus energy and swords dance, had surrounded the Kangaskhan. They simultaneously raised their scythes and brought a brick breakdown on its head. Boom! 6 super effective fighting type moves struck directly. This time, the Kangaskhan finally couldn't take it anymore. It collapsed without a sound, unconscious. The battle was finally over. It had taken a thunderbolt, an aquatail, a water pulse, a wrap, a thunder, and 6 boosted brick breaks to take down this one Kangaskhan. It was as tough as a monster. Will's own condition was now at its limit, he was on the verge of fainting himself. He had taken a rock tomb, an ice punch, a headbutt, and a crunch from a Kangaskhan nearly 10 levels higher than him. Scyther? The old alpha asked, walking up to him. He was asking if they should finish it off. Normally, Will would have just let it go. But this time, he was hesitant. He didn't want to kill a Pokémon, but given this Kangaskhan's state, if they didn't deal with her permanently, she might come back. What should he do? Zubat bat! At that moment, the Zubat actually flew over from the cave. And following behind it was a small, purple creature. Will looked closely. Wasn't that a baby Kangaskhan? He looked at the baby, then at the fainted mother, and almost coughed up a mouthful of blood. You couldn't have come earlier? You show up after the fight is over. Will, who had managed to stay conscious until now, could no longer hold on. His body fell backward, and he fainted. He wasn't worried about his injuries. He was confident that by now, the Scyther had learned how to use medicinal herbs to treat external wounds. When he opened his eyes again, it was the next morning. He turned his head. The Kangaskhan had woken up at some point and was now sitting in a corner, doting on her baby. This thing really is a monster, Will blinked. It had been so heavily injured, yet it had woken up even faster than him. Its recovery ability was terrifying. Roar! The Kangaskhan, now clearly calm, saw that Will was awake and repeatedly apologized to him, holding her baby. How did you know ice-type moves were super effective against me? Will asked. He was more concerned about this question now. Since she was calm, he decided to get to the bottom of it. Chapter 79, The Clan in the Valley. Roar, the Kangaskhan said, pointing towards the deeper part of MT Silver and making a few gestures. When Will heard what she said, his composure vanished. His eyes widened and he shot up to his full height. The Kangaskhan had said that her clan, in the central region of MT Silver, often fought with others, and that near their territory was a clan of Pokémon just like Will. Because the two clans fought so often, the Kangaskhan clan knew that to fight a Pokémon like him, you had to use ice-type moves. There was a Dragonite clan in the center of MT Silver. The shock in Will's heart was indescribable. He had always thought that the Dragonite clan should live on an isolated island in the boundless ocean, or perhaps even in the sea itself. After all, the Pokédex mentioned that somewhere in the vast ocean, there seems to be an island inhabited only by Dragonite, and also that it is said to fly over the vast ocean to rescue people who are drowning. Even the giant ancient Dragonite in the anime had come from the direction of the sea and returned to it. So, Will had never imagined that he could find other members of the Dragonite line in MT Silver. But now, it all made sense. Pokémon didn't truly understand type matchups, and this Kangaskhan was no exception. She had simply memorized that you had to use Ice-type moves to fight a Dragonair. I want to go to the center of MT Silver for a look. Could I trouble you to lead the way? Will hesitated for a moment, but decided to ask. He wanted to see what a Dragonite clan from the era of primal beasts looked like. But with his current strength, getting to the center of the mountain would be extremely difficult, so he asked the Kangaskhan, ostensibly to guide him, but in reality, wanting her as a bodyguard. Roar! The Kangaskhan felt guilty towards Will, so she agreed without hesitation. Scyther! Zubat! No, you all stay here. I'll go by myself. Once the decision was made, he was ready to go. Will twisted his body, felt that his injuries had mostly recovered, and then set off with the Kangaskhan towards the center of MT Silver. Along the way, Will also learned a lot about the central region from her. First, the territories. The outer ring of MT Silver had hundreds of territories, and the middle ring had dozens. But the central region had only 6. 3 on land, 2 in the sky, and 1 underground. The 3 on land were, the Kangaskhan clan, the Radon clan, and the Dragonite clan. Although the Dragonite clan could fly, they spent more of their time on land, so their territory was also on the ground. The Kangaskhan clan had learned their rock-type moves from fighting the Radon clan, and their ice-type moves from fighting the Dragonite clan. The rulers of the sky were divided between day and night. The daytime rulers often switched between the Pidgeot and Fearow clans. The rulers of the night were the Crobat clan. At night, their only enemies were the few ghost-type Pokémon in MT Silver and an extremely small Honchkrow clan. They were practically unrivaled, so the night sky was their domain. The ruler of the underground, however, was terrifying. As everyone knew, the true wealth of the MT Silver range was the countless mineral resources within the mountain itself. There were innumerable tunnels and caves, mostly occupied by rock and ground-type Pokémon. Will had never set foot there. This underground ruler had no clan, just a single individual, but it ruled an underground territory larger than MT Silver itself. Based on the Kangaskhan's description, Will deduced this Pokémon was Tyranitar, the Godzilla of the Pokémon world. The late bloomer of the second generation. The Lord of the Sandstorm. One of only 2 pseudo-legendaries without the dragon type. The only Pokémon in existence with the rock/dark type combination. These were just its most famous attributes, a deeper dive would reveal much more. However, Will didn't think he would ever meet this Pokémon in this life, so he had no plans to learn more about it. He asked more about the Dragonite and Crobat clans. The former was obvious. As for the latter, he felt it might have something to do with his Zubat, though it was more likely that it didn't. The Zubat line was full of potential, but they were also very numerous. You could find them in almost any cave in Kanto and Johto. The Zubat population on MT Silver alone was probably in the 500 or 600s. Will and the Kangaskhan chatted as they traveled. Along the way, he witnessed some truly absurdly powerful Pokémon. For example, a 3-meter-tall Sandslash that shattered a Nidoking's horn with one swipe, and a 4.7-meter-tall Machamp that used a 7-meter-long tree as a weapon. Seeing that creature, Will once again lamented how limited humanity's research on Pokémon still was, even in the era of leagues. In this era, there was no such thing as trading via computer, yet Wild Machop could still evolve into their third stage, Machamp. And the most exaggerated thing he saw was, without a doubt, a nearly 27-meter-long Steelix. When Will saw it, he felt like an earthworm looking at a python. The Steelix was sleeping at the time, otherwise, they would have had to take a detour or risk being killed. I've really underestimated how terrifying this central region is, Will thought. He had originally thought that with his and his crew's strength, they could probably survive here. But now it seemed he was far too naive. If even these monsters couldn't claim a spot as one of the rulers, then coming here would be like a lamb walking into a tiger's den. No wonder MT Silver was the most difficult area in the Kanto region in the games. And no wonder that even after 1,000 years, it remained a core location for the 2 regions and the site of the Pokémon League headquarters. This mountain was filled with natural guardians. Will estimated that this Steelix alone could probably scatter the entire Beast Caller army of either kingdom. He didn't know the average level of the Land Kingdom's army, but in the Dragonite Kingdoms, the average Pokémon level was around 43. The Pokémon of the top generals were at most LV 50. And the level of this Steelix, just from the way the Kangaskhan tiptoed past it, it had to be at least LV 60. Will and the Kangaskhan had set out at dawn and had walked until the afternoon without even stopping for lunch. It wasn't that the journey was that long, but the Kangaskhan, concerned for her baby and the dangers of the forest, moved very slowly. Finally, as the sun began to set, she stopped. "Roar," she said, pointing to a small hill in front of them, then turning to leave. She meant that the Dragonite clan's territory was just over the hill. She couldn't go any further and had to return to her own clan. At the same time, she also said that if the Dragonites didn't welcome Will, he could go to the Kangaskhan clan's territory, which was in the forest to the south. "Am I here?" Will watched the Kangaskhan leave, then cautiously flew to the top of the hill and looked over to the other side. The next moment, his eyes lit up. On the other side of the hill was a sizable valley plain, with a winding river running through it. The entire valley was surrounded on all sides by small hills, like a city wall blocking out all danger. The plain itself looked incredibly peaceful. Will could see a few small Dratini rolling around in the grass. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, who would have imagined that in a place as dangerous as MT Silver, there could be such a paradise? A paradise built by the Dragonite themselves. Will looked at the hills, they didn't seem to be naturally formed. He guessed that the Dragonite clan had meticulously crafted this territory for themselves. He then began to carefully observe the clan in the valley. It was truly large. There were at least 7 or 8 Dragonite, and the number of Dragonair and Dratini combined was over 40. Although the number seemed large, almost contradicting the rare impression that pseudo-legendaries give most fans, it all depends on the era. In the future era of leagues, with specialized breeding facilities like the Dragon Holy Land or Meteor Falls, the numbers of both starters and pseudo-legendaries increased greatly. The reason they were rare for ordinary trainers was because they were difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to raise, not because the species itself was truly that scarce. A pseudo-legendary is only rare to the common person. In the Masters 8 tournament, 12 out of the 64 Pokémon were pseudo-legendaries, which proves the point. The Pokémon League doesn't stop ordinary trainers from owning them, it's just that ordinary trainers really can't afford them. But in the current era of primal beasts, pseudo-legendaries were truly, genuinely rare. This rare had no exaggeration. They grew too slowly. Without the protection of their elders, they would never survive to reach their powerful final stage. Will himself, who fought and trained every day, was still a long way from becoming a Dragonite after a year. What more needs to be said for other wild Dragonair and Dratini, who generally survive by hiding at the bottom of the water and growing naturally by eating plankton and small shrimp. The slowness of that process needs no further explanation. Chapter 80, Training in Dragonite Valley. Night. Just as Will was secretly observing the valley, a soft cry sounded by his ear, and a puff of hot air blew against his head wing. Whoa! Will shuddered, his body almost going limp. A Dragonair's head wings are very sensitive, even more so than a human's earlobe. But when he came to his senses, the scales all over his body stood on end. He stared wide-eyed at the creature that had made the sound. It was a Dragonite. Good heavens, buddy, you are ugly. Yes, Will was face-blind, that was true. But a shiny Dragonite was ugly even by human aesthetic standards. As everyone knows, Pokémon players have a certain obsession with shinies, but that does not include shiny Dragonite. A shiny Dratini and a shiny Dragonair are pink, looking very pretty and cute. But their evolution, this shiny Dragonite, was truly a tragic sight. It looked like a giant, mobile booger. Night. The Dragonite, seeing Will staring at it, scratched its head a little shyly. He knew he was handsome, after all, he was the heartthrob of the clan. But being stared at like this was still a little embarrassing. "Hello," Will said, not knowing what else to say, so he just nodded. Night. Yes, I came from the outside. I grew up on my own. Dragonite. The shiny Dragonite was shocked to hear Will's words. It then reached out and gave him a big hug. As a dragon who had been there, it couldn't imagine how miserable Will's life must have been. It had to bring this kinsman back to the clan and let him feel their great warmth and great love. Ooh, so soft and warm, Will thought. It was his first time being hugged by a Dragonite, and the feeling was quite wonderful. A Dragonite's body has no fur, but its cream-colored belly is incredibly soft. And its body temperature was completely different from a Dragonair's, it was very warm. The moment he was hugged, Will felt himself starting to get sleepy. Before he knew it, he had been carried back to the valley by the shiny Dragonite. Seeing a strange Dragonair appear, the other Dragonite, Dragonair, and Dratini all gathered around, their eyes filled with surprise, because Will was huge. In the era of primal beasts, the upper limit for a Dragonair's length should have been about 8 meters. Will's 10 meters was already 2.5 times the Pokédex value. He was a Dragonair whose length had been affected by his strength. Knight. The leader of the Dragonite clan was a giant, 8-meter-tall Dragonite. A height like this was not just due to the alpha bonus, it was definitely also influenced by its outstanding strength. Will couldn't even imagine how high this Dragonite's level must be. Knight, the shiny Dragonite explained Will's situation. This made the other clan members feel very sorry for him. They all took out their own treasures to share with him and invited him to stay. One particularly lovely female Dragonair even sidled up to him and wrapped the tip of her tail around his. Although Will had never interacted with other Dragonair in this life, he could guess the meaning of this action from her eyes. He immediately performed a dragon tail, sweeping the female aside. "I'll gladly accept this, but as for staying, I'll have to pass," Will said, taking a dragon fang from a female Dragonite but refusing their other kind offers. Mainly because the dragon fang was just too good to refuse. It could increase the power of his dragon-type moves by 20%, an item on the same level as the mystic water. Dragonite. The Alpha asked, tilting its head, wanting to know the reason. MT Silver was so dangerous, and Will was still so young. If he didn't stay here, where could he go? In the past, I was taken in by a. Will hesitated for a moment, then briefly explained his and Liz's story. Knight. Yes, we can be partners with humans. At least, Liz is trustworthy. I will return to her side. And you, if you ever encounter any difficulties in the future and can no longer survive in MT Silver, then go and find her and her people. In that direction, you will find humans with red and blue hair, Will said, pointing in the direction of the Dragonite Kingdom. Knight, Dragonite. The Alpha glanced in that direction, not particularly concerned, but still nodded to show he had taken note of it. At the same time, it placed a hand on Will's body. Can I? Will's eyes widened in pleasant surprise as he looked at the big, chubby dragon. The Alpha's meaning was that if Will wasn't in a hurry to leave, he could stay with the clan for a few days and learn some skills from them. He was, of course, more than willing. Although he couldn't see the Alpha's level, to be one of the rulers in the center of MT Silver, its level had to be incredibly high, and its move pool was surely very deep. Even their rival, the Kangaskhan, could learn Ice Beam and Ice Punch from fighting them. There was no reason he couldn't learn a few moves before he left. Dragonite. The Alpha patted its chest with its other hand, promising that it was no problem at all. Can I come back in a couple of days? I'd like to go back and inform my partner first. Knight. The Alpha nodded and beckoned, calling over 2 other Dragonite. The meaning was clear, they would escort him back and then bring him here again. Although the Alpha didn't look old, it was actually over 1,000 years old. It knew the situation in MT Silver better than anyone. It knew that if it let Will go back alone, there was a good chance he would die on the way. Therefore, it called 2 clan members to escort him. Thank you very much, Will said gratefully, looking at the 2 Dragonite. One of them was the shiny one. Both were about 4.5 meters tall, not too absurd. This meant that at their age, their strength was not so outstanding as to affect their height. But could a Dragonite's age be compared to an ordinary Pokémon's? Although these 2 looked like babies, they were probably at least 300 or 400 years old. Come to think of it, he, at the age of 1, would probably have to call the youngest Dratini in this clan uncle or aunt. After such a long period of accumulation, this clan only had about 50 members. Could that still be called a lot? As for the strength of the 2 Dragonite, they were certainly no weaker than that Kangaskhan, they would only be stronger. The evolution requirement for a Dragonair to become a Dragonite was around LV 55, so any Dragonite that appeared would not be below that level. This trip for Will was guaranteed to be safe and profitable. On the way back to the cave, Will discovered that his 2 Dragonite escorts had definitely made a name for themselves in the central region. Many powerful-looking Pokémon would give way when they saw them, not daring to cause trouble. When Will returned to the cave with the 2 giant Dragonite, the Scyther crew was shocked. Scyther. The old Alpha was stunned to hear from Will that his kin were one of the supreme rulers of MT Silver. At the same time, it felt happy for Will and wished him well in his training. Zubat. The Zubat, on the other hand, immediately clung to him. Its meaning was clear, it wanted to go with him to Dragonite Valley. Will didn't refuse. The Scyther couldn't take good care of the Zubat, and the middle ring was not safe for it. In contrast, although Dragonite Valley was in the most dangerous central region, with the protection of the Dragonite clan, it was actually the safest place for the Zubat. I'll be back after a while. I hope your strength has improved by then. After all, we can only be an invincible team if our strengths are similar, Will said. Scyther, the old alpha patted its chest, expressing its confidence. It had already learned from Will the reason for his rapid growth, constant battling. Although most wild Pokémon were unwilling to engage in meaningless battles that lowered their survival chances, this Scyther was one of the few exceptions. The incident with the leadership change had already ignited a desire for strength in its heart. Now, with Will's words to motivate it, it would naturally fight hard to raise its level. It did not want to lack the strength to stand by Will's side in the future. Goodbyes between Pokémon don't require many words. Will returned to pick up the Zubat, then turned and left with the two Dragonite. Besides, it wasn't as if they would never see each other again. Pokémon have a deep faith in the words "see you again." Since they had said it, they would surely meet again one day. On the way back to Dragonite Valley, Will and the Zubat were carried by the two Dragonite. The two of them hadn't known the way to the cave, which was why they had let Will lead and had flown slower. There was no need for that on the way back. Is a Dragonite fast? If it hasn't been specially trained, not particularly. A funny thing is that in the Pokédex, a Dragonite is described as being able to circle the Earth in just 16 hours, but its speed stat is only 80. So, the Pokédex is total nonsense. A Dragonite's speed can only be attributed to the move Extreme Speed. Among non-legendary Pokémon, only 4 can learn Extreme Speed naturally: Arcanine, Dragonite, Lucario, and Togekiss. 2 others can learn it through inheritance: Pikachu and Linoone.
Thanks for listening.